Hey guys, tonight we're entering the cobblestoned world of medieval knights, but not the gleaming honor-bound paragons your school textbooks probably described. No, tonight, we're peeling back the polished visor to find out what really lurked underneath the helmet. Imagine the rustle of chainmail as you trudge through a muddy village, your boots soaked, your armor dented, and your code of chivalry. Well, let's just say it's more like a polite suggestion than a law. The banners flutter, but behind them, a mix of ambition, bodily odor, and unpaid debts. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where and when you're watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not in a castle banquet tonight. You're on a rocky trail beside a knight named Richard. His surcoat is stained, his sword notched, and his squires long gone to fetch ale. Chivalry, the supposed knightly code of loyalty, honor, and courtly love, sounds noble enough. But in reality, it was more of an ideal than a practice, and even then, not everyone cared. See, the chivalric code was less universal knight conduct manual and more a literary invention. Think of it like medieval PR. Epic poems and courtly literature painted knights as defenders of the weak, loyal to king and country, and ever courteous to noble ladies. But on the ground, in rain-slicked armor and sore from saddle rash, most knights were busy pillaging rival manors and chasing glory or money. Richard, our knight, doesn't spend his time rescuing maidens. He's more likely to be caught arguing over grain prices with a merchant or shaking down peasants for overdue taxes. Historians still argue whether the chivalric ideal influenced behavior at all, or whether it was just a bedtime story for nobles to feel better about their brutal lifestyle. Sure, there were tournaments, but they were less about virtuous contest and more about brutal, slightly regulated brawls. Spectators cheered as knights unhorsed each other for prize money, marriage proposals, or political clout. And the no-killing rule often ignored, especially when rivalries ran deep. Nothing says noble sport like being dragged unconscious from the mud by your own squire. And the poor chivalry didn't apply to them. Knights were often the enforcers of harsh feudal justice, extracting rents and doling out punishments. You might be thrown in a ditch for stealing bread, even if the knight owed more in gambling debts than you could ever imagine. Even other nobles weren't safe. Feuds between knightly families were so common that entire counties kept records just to sort out who owed whom for which burnt barn or kidnapped cousin. It wasn't all grim, of course. Some knights did try to live by the ideals they heard sung in castles. They gave alms, protected travelers, and avoided unnecessary violence. But they were the exceptions. And even they sometimes gave in to greed, vengeance, or the pressure to act like a real knight, which usually meant bash in someone's head and look dramatic doing it. The contradictions were glaring. Imagine a knight swearing oaths to protect the innocent, then turning around to torch a rival's granary, or penning verses to his lady love, while also planning how to poison his rival's well. These weren't inconsistencies, they were part of the package. Knights were taught that being brave in battle earned you honor, but also that honor could mean defending your family's name through any means necessary, even, say, ambushing someone at midnight with 30 armed men. Remember that the whole concept of nobility was as much about image as bloodline. Knights had to look the part, act the part, and sponsor enough religious causes to appear respectable. But behind closed doors, It was about alliances, favors, and influence. One historian called it muddy-handed idealism romantic, on the page, dirty in practice. And that's the paradox we'll ride alongside tonight. Noble dreams on stained scrolls and messy boots trampling through them. As the moonlight glints off Richard's battered helm, you sense the weight of centuries of myth. But you also hear his stomach growl. He's not thinking about honor. He's wondering if that inn ahead has soup. Before we ride into battle, here's something to puzzle over. If knights were the ultimate warriors of their time, why did so many of them die in embarrassing, clumsy, or entirely avoidable ways? Could it be that the armor wasn't the problem, but the knight inside it? You're standing on the edge of a churned-up field, nostrils full of the metallic sting of blood and manure. It's early morning, the kind where fog clings to the grass like a warning. Your horse, already sweating, snorts uneasily beneath you. And you, brave knight, can barely see 3 feet through the haze. This is not the grand battlefield of Hollywood fame. No clean duels, no trumpet fanfare, no choreographed clashing of swords under a dramatic sky. This is a slog, a shouting match of confusion. Horses scream. Men slip in mud. Arrows fly, though, from where you can't quite tell. Welcome to the actual mechanics of medieval warfare. Forget what your school said about knights riding gloriously into battle. Real battles were chaotic and short. Sometimes no more than 30 minutes of yelling, flailing, and accidental trampling. There was no elegant choreography. You might not even see your opponent's face before they clubbed you in the back of the head with a flanged mace. And speaking of heads, let's talk helmets. Your great helm may look imposing, but it fogs up faster than a boiled kettle. Visibility near zero. Breathing like trying to inhale through a soup can. One wrong turn, and you're swinging at your own side. Historians still argue whether knights were more effective as shock troops or as battlefield liabilities, clanking around like disoriented tin cans. Richard, the same knight from earlier, doesn't look majestic as he charges. He's leaning forward to balance the weight of his armor, bouncing like a sack of turnips strapped to a wagon. And that gallant sword he's holding, it's mostly for show. The real damage comes from his lance used once, and then tossed aside like a medieval paper towel. And yet, here's a surprising twist. Many knights didn't die in the thick of it. They died off to the side, from heat stroke, from being crushed beneath their horses, or grimly common, from falling off those horses and being unable to get back up in full plate. Knights often needed help to even stand once knocked down. If your squire ran off, you were essentially a beached turtle. One famous example comes from the Battle of Crécy in 1346, where French knights charged uphill into a storm of English longbow fire. They were so weighed down that when they fell, they became obstacles for the next wave. It was less a glorious charge and more a slow, expensive pileup. The armor itself, though protective, was no miracle. A well-placed arrow, especially one with a bodkin tip, could pierce mail. And let's not forget the bludgeoning weapons, maces, flails, morning stars. These didn't need to pierce. They just needed to rattle your insides like a gong until you stopped moving. There's a reason medieval texts often describe knights groaning like broken windmills after battle. And then there's the mud. Always the mud. European battlefields, especially in spring and autumn, turned into quicksand. One misplaced step and down, you went face first into nature's shame sponge. Remember, there were no waterproof linings, no modern boot grips. If you fell, you could suffocate in your helmet stuck in muck, while horses thundered past. And let's not overlook the sheer psychological toll. You weren't galloping confidently into battle. You were praying your horse didn't trip, your armor didn't jam, and your bladder held until lunch. Many knights lost their composure before fights, sometimes had an unfortunate incident mid-battle during. The tension was less noble calm and more panicked sweat inside a tin oven. Yet despite all this, people still romanticize the knightly role. Chronicles describe these muddy brawls with ridiculous poetry. Sir Geoffrey smote his foe with valor, unmatched sure right after slipping in a pig trough and being dragged 20 feet by his panicked steed. The disconnect between reality and retelling was monumental. And training limited. Contrary to legend, most knights weren't lifelong martial artists. They practiced occasionally, sure, especially the wealthier ones, but many relied more on intimidation and reputation than actual skill. It wasn't uncommon for a half-drunk knight to stumble into battle barely knowing which end of the spear to hold. This brings us to a key detail: teamwork, or the lack thereof. While we think of knights as fighting in formations, many preferred solo glory. They wanted to be the hero, not the flank support. This led to plenty of solo charges, abandoned allies, and unnecessary deaths. One knight, charging ahead for honor, could doom an entire line. And don't forget, battle was business. Knights were expensive. Their armor horses and squires represented years of investment. Losing a knight wasn't just a tragedy, it was a financial catastrophe. That's why some knights wore bright symbols and shouted their names repeatedly during fights, not for honor, but so enemies knew to capture them for ransom instead of killing them. Because that's the real economic engine of medieval warfare, not victory, but hostage-taking. Capturing a wealthy knight could bring in more silver than looting 3 villages. So while arrows flew, many combatants scanned the field not for enemies, but for injured nobility to snatch like coupons. Still, even with all the mud clumsiness and confusion, there was prestige in battle. If you lived, returning home bloodied but alive elevated your status instantly. You might get land titles or the best seat at the feast, assuming you weren't still recovering from a dented skull. So tonight, as you drift deeper into that medieval fog picture, not the polished warrior of fantasy, but the exhausted man beneath. Breath wheezing, armor pinching, horse growling. He's not thinking about glory. He's hoping the sun doesn't come out too soon, or he'll bake inside his helmet. He's thinking about soup again. What would you give to smell like molten metal, spoiled meat, and boiled cabbage every day? No, this isn't a medieval riddle. It's your daily scent as a fully armed knight. But what did it actually take to keep all that shiny armor wearable, and why did it often involve natural ammonia? You wake up to the clank of iron, not battle laundry day. Because while everyone loves the idea of knights gleaming in polished plate, few think about how that gleam is achieved. And spoiler, it doesn't involve dry cleaning. Welcome to the exhausting, surprisingly weird world of medieval armor upkeep. Let's start with the basic misunderstanding. Armor was not a single outfit. It was layers. First, you had a padded gambeson, a quilted coat stuffed with horsehair or scrap cloth that absorbed blows and soaked up a medieval week's worth of sweat. Over that came chainmail. If you were lucky, then the infamous plate armor, and each layer had to be cleaned differently. But first, let's talk money. Armor was painfully expensive. A full suit of high-quality plate armor could cost as much as a small cottage or even a modest estate. Knights didn't just buy armor off the rack. It was custom-made, fitted over time, often by the same blacksmith who maintained it. Think of it like a car mechanic who also moonlights as your tailor with hammers. And like a car armor needed constant maintenance, metal rusts, especially in soggy European climates. Rain sweat and mud were constant threats. So how did knights fight corrosion? The main weapon wasn't oil or wax. It was elbow grease. Or more precisely, the elbow grease of a squire or hired armor polisher. Every morning, before a ride or display, someone had to rub down the entire suit with a mix of sand vinegar and, yes, natural ammonia. Human natural ammonia contains ammonia, which breaks down oils and tarnish. It was the original degreaser. So while you're imagining chivalry and gallant duels, remember someone was likely scrubbing a greave with pea-soaked straw, and that was just to keep the armor looking nice. Inside, it was chaos. Those padded undergarments, they soaked up everything. Sweat blood, food spills, wine stains. Knights rarely changed them unless preparing for a feast or ceremony, which meant bacteria flourished. Rashes, skin infections, and unpleasant odors were as much a part of knighthood as swords and oaths. Then came the logistical nightmare of storage. You couldn't just toss armor in a chest. Pieces had to be hung or padded to avoid dents. Leather straps dried and cracked. Hinges had to be greased regularly. And heaven forbid a mouse chewed through your arming cords, you'd arrive at the battlefield, half naked clutching a shin plate. Even travel was complicated. When knights went on campaign, they brought entire wagons just to haul their gear. Some required multiple squires just to carry armor weapons tents and personal grooming kits. These weren't nimble warriors, they were medieval mobile homes with legs. Still, knights took pride in their gear. Your armor was your reputation made metal. Dings and scars were trophies. Engraved patterns and gilded trim shouted wealth. Colored enamel or etched family crests weren't just for show, they were advertising. In tournaments especially, a flashy set of armor could impress nobles and draw the attention of potential patrons or marriage alliances. Of course, there were downsides. One was heat. In summer, knights baked. There are accounts of men fainting during parades or collapsing mid-duel from heat exhaustion. In one memorable French tournament, a knight had to be carried out after cooking himself like a roast inside his own cuirass. And weight. It's often exaggerated. A full suit weighed about 45–60 pounds, roughly the same as a modern hiking pack. But weight distribution mattered. On a horse, it was manageable. On foot, not so much. Running rare. Jumping, not happening. If you tripped, you hoped someone was nearby to help you up before you cooked, drowned, or got looted. There's also the noise. Armor was not stealthy. Hinges squeaked, plates clanked, and chainmail jangled. Walking through a quiet hall at night, like dragging a bag of pots through a cathedral. Even the lightest step made you sound like a cutlery drawer having an argument. Yet for all the trouble, knights loved their armor. It was a symbol of status profession, and if well kept, invincibility. Enemies hesitated when they saw a shining knight ride into battle, not knowing whether they were facing a seasoned warrior or a bard with a really good inheritance. Let's not forget tournaments again, where armor became pageantry. Knights donned exaggerated shoulder flares, heart-shaped visors, or helmets with full-blown wings and antlers. It wasn't about practicality anymore. It was fashion theater, and ego rolled into one. These events were Instagram before cameras armor was your filter. And the most absurd part, armor didn't always match the weaponry of the time. As crossbows and early firearms became widespread, armor had to be thickened, which made it heavier, which made knights slower. Eventually, some armor became so heavy and intricate it was only usable in ceremonial parades or jousts. On actual battlefields, simpler, lighter gear often replaced it. Still, the myth of the armored knight endured. Art showed them shimmering like chrome angels. Chronicles described armor as mirror bright. But in truth, most knights had scratches, dents, and a faint odor of mold. And if you looked closely, you'd probably spot a faint yellow tinge from last week's cleaning session. So next time you imagine a knight suiting up for battle, don't picture a magical transformation. Picture a 45-minute ordeal involving multiple servants, animal grease, human waste, and a whole lot of swearing. And remember, the bravest knights weren't always the best fighters. They were the ones willing to climb into 60 pounds of rust-prone misery every morning, knowing full well that a misstep might not lead to glory, but to getting stuck face first in a ditch. Let's play a little imagination game. What if you walked into a medieval village expecting to find fainting maidens and heroic knights, but instead met a steely-eyed widow who owned more land than the local lord, who really had the power back then, and who was just good at pretending? You trudge into a manor courtyard, expecting the usual scene. The knight returns, peasants bow, and a delicate lady clutches her embroidery. Instead, the peasants ignore the knight, the lady barks orders at servants, and she's scribbling Latin into a ledger, thicker than a monk's wine belly. Welcome to the overlooked reality of medieval gender roles. Contrary to the fantasy of helpless women waiting in towers, many medieval women, especially noble women, held serious power. In fact, the medieval lady of the manor was often the actual manager of estates laborers and sometimes even local justice. While her husband or knight son or absentee cousin gallivanted off to war or jousting tournaments, she stayed behind and ran the show. Meet Lady Alienor Richard's older sister. She doesn't wear a crown, but she owns orchards mills and a mildly terrifying stare. With Richard off polishing his armor or his ego, Alienor handles land disputes, harvest planning, and the occasional ecclesiastical bribe. In her hall, the account scrolls are longer than the tapestry of her family tree. This wasn't uncommon. Women of status often acted as estate stewards, guardians of younger heirs, and even wartime defenders. There are documented cases of noblewomen leading castle defenses while their husbands were away. They negotiated taxed and punished. One 13th century letter from a baroness scolds her tenant for avoiding rent with the same icy precision you'd expect from a tax lawyer. Even among the peasantry, women weren't passive. They worked in the fields, brewed ale, sometimes exclusively traded in markets, and raised the next generation of mostly unwashed future field hands. A working peasant household was often co-managed with women, contributing vital labor and decision-making. So where did the whole damsel in distress myth come from? Partly from literature. Troubadours loved a good sob story. Songs and poems about ladies trapped in towers or longing for distant nights played well in candlelit courts. The more tragic the tale, the better. And hey, it gave bored nobles something to swoon over between duck courses. But here's the twist. Many of these tales were written by men for men. The romantic damsel was less a reflection of reality and more a projection, an excuse for the knight to feel noble-needed and vaguely poetic. Historians still argue whether this literary device did more to obscure than to reveal the actual social dynamics. Let's not give medieval society too much credit, though. Patriarchy was real. Laws favored men in inheritance marriage arrangements and political influence. But within those constraints, women found and fiercely protected their spheres of control. For example, marriage. Noble marriages were alliances more than romances, but that didn't mean women were pawns. A clever widow could wield immense influence. Widows retained legal rights to dowries dower lands, and in many regions could even refuse remarriage. Some used this power to become matriarchs, silent but immovable forces behind entire dynasties. Lady Alienor is on her second widowhood. Her first husband died of dysentery. Her second, of most unfortunate oil incident, a phrase that made every steward nervous for months. Now she holds her late husband's estates, guards her children's inheritances, and has absolutely no intention of remarrying. Why would she? She has control coin and 3 threatening letters from bishops asking her to pay her tithes on time. There were even rare women who wielded direct political power: Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France, Matilda of Tuscany, names that sound like side characters in knight tales, but were actually central power brokers. They led armies, plotted coups, and dictated succession. Even in religious life, women could carve out influence. Abbacies controlled lands, wealth, and communities of nuns that rivaled small towns. Some wrote theological texts, corresponded with popes, and enforced strict discipline. Monasteries weren't just spiritual retreats, they were economic centers, and their leaders were often savvy administrators. Among the merchant class, women ran shops, managed inns, and inherited businesses. Some cities had guilds that allowed female participation, especially in textiles and brewing. In fact, so many women dominated medieval ale production that the term alewife became a staple. It also helped that brewing didn't just mean profit, it meant power. Control the beer, and you controlled local commerce. Now, that's not to say life was fair. Women still faced brutal legal penalties for immodest behavior. They could be married off without consent, and childbirth was an ever-present danger. Medicine being what it was, sea leeches' prayers, and vague herbalism surviving past age 30 with your teeth intact was a minor miracle. But the next time someone says women in the Middle Ages had no power, remember this. While knights were off swinging swords, women were collecting taxes, negotiating grain prices, and making sure the world didn't fall apart. Power isn't always noisy. Sometimes it wears a wimple, raises an eyebrow, and signs a contract while 3 men argue about horses outside. So tonight, as you drift into that candle-lit manor, with tapestries swaying in the wind, picture Alienor not waiting by the window, but checking ledgers, managing servants, and sending one last perfectly sharpened letter to the bishop about that tax exemption. You may not find her name in many poems, but her ink is in every law book. Let's take a moment to picture this. You're trapped in a metal suit, it's 95 degrees out, and you suddenly realize there's no bathroom break in battle. So how did knights encased in 60 pounds of steel actually deal with the most human of needs? The jousting field is quiet now. The last echoes of cheers and hoofbeats fade into the late afternoon hum. Your armor's dented, your legs ache, and as you shuffle toward the pavilion, you realize you've got a more pressing concern than honor or chivalry. You really, really have to pee. Welcome to one of the most ignored realities of nightly life hygiene. Or more precisely, the complete lack of convenient hygiene when you're wrapped head to toe in metal and linen for hours on end. While tales of glorious battle and noble quests abound, no one likes to talk about what knights did when nature came knocking. First things first, There were no zippers, or buttons, or helpful elastic waistbands. Underneath the armor, a knight wore multiple layers: a linen shirt, padded gambeson chausses, sort of woolen leggings, and then the actual armor plates. Getting in or out of that setup was a team effort, usually requiring the help of a squire. So, if you needed to relieve yourself mid-march, or just before a duel, you were out of luck unless you planned ahead. Some knights adopted the strategy of strategic timing, emptying themselves just before armoring up a medieval version of the long road trip bathroom break. Others, well, let's just say they let go where they stood. Accounts suggest that knights, especially during extended battle scenarios or long parades, sometimes lost their composure right in their gear. No one was going to pause the skirmish so Sir Geoffrey could find a bush. And remember, armor was heavy hot and pressed tight against the body. Once soaked, it stayed soaked. That mix of sweat, bodily waste, and mud turned your elegant suit of armor into a slow-cooked discomfort trap. Some modern reenactors have even reported rashes, fungal infections, and minor burns from hours inside period-authentic suits. That's without the urine. This raises the next fun question: how often did knights bathe? The answer is complicated. Contrary to popular myth, medieval people did bathe. Public bathhouses were common in many cities, and wealthy nobles often had tubs brought to their chambers. Knights returning from campaign might soak in herbal infusions, think lavender rosemary, or mint boiled and poured into steaming tubs. But regular hygiene routines, rare. Baths were time-consuming, and heating water took hours. In winter, pipes froze. In castles, privacy was limited. And on campaign, the nearest bath was usually a stream shared with the horses. Most knights cleaned their faces and hands daily, but full-body bathing might happen weekly or less if things got busy. Instead, knights relied on linen, specifically clean underlayers, to stay fresh. The idea was that sweat would soak the linen, not the outer clothes. Change your underclothes regularly, and you wouldn't have to bathe as often. It worked about as well as you'd expect. Then there's the mouth. Medieval dental care was surprisingly proactive in some circles. Wealthier knights brushed with twigs or cloth, rinsed with vinegar or wine, and chewed herbs like parsley or cloves to freshen breath. But toothpaste as we know it, non-existent. And without modern sugar processing, most cavities came from fermented grain or dried fruit. Bad breath, though ubiquitous. Foot care, even worse. Boots weren't designed for comfort. After hours of marching, jousting, or dancing, yes, knights danced. Feet were swollen, blistered, and usually unwashed. Fungal infections like trench foot were common. Some knights rubbed pig fat or lanolin on their feet to prevent cracking. Others just winced and limped dramatically. And don't even start on the latrine situation. In castles, garderobes were vertical shafts leading down to cesspits, basically a glorified hole in the wall with a plank. Knights squatted over it and hoped the wind blew the right way. On the road, it was dig a pit and hope no one watches. In cities, chamber pots were the norm, emptied out of windows, often with a shouted warning. Or not. One document from 14th century London details a knight being hit by the contents of a second-story pot mid-conversation. The chronicler was sympathetic, but also notes that he recovered swiftly and drank afterward, which seems both horrifying and impressively nonchalant. And yes, there were toiletries. Soap existed made from animal fat and lye, but it was harsh and rarely used daily. Combs were carved from wood or bone. Perfumes were distilled from flowers or spices and applied to clothing, not skin. Some knights carried pomanders, small scented orbs to combat smells during court appearances. Think of it as a wearable air freshener. What about shaving beards? Were fashionable in some eras, taboo in others. Knights typically used straight razors or had a servant do it. Accidents were frequent, so were scars. Beards hid pockmarks and injuries, which is why many older knights looked like a mix between a pirate and a cranky forest god. Despite all these challenges, hygiene wasn't ignored. It just operated under different priorities. A knight might go months without a proper bath, but would never be caught with a dull sword or dusty boots before a ceremony. Cleanliness was a sign of wealth and preparation, but not necessarily health. And then there's the armor removal ritual. After a long day, stripping off armor was a group event. Squires unsnapped greaves, tugged at gauntlets, and finally lifted the breastplate off often, while the knight wheezed like a broken bellows. Underneath the gambeson was soaked. Linen underclothes clung to every contour, and the smell. One chronicler described it as the scent of a tired barn on a rainy day. Yet even after all this, knights still relished the armor. The discomfort, the filth, the inconvenience, it was part of the identity. You weren't just a soldier. You were a knight. You suffered for the role. You endured the stink, the sweat, the fungal agony, because being armored meant power, prestige, and a front row seat at the political table. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine not the shining armor, but the soggy underpants, the squires holding their noses, the carefully timed bathroom breaks. Because in the end, behind every myth of nobility, there's a very human story, usually involving a garderobe, a bit of vinegar, and a whole lot of linen. Rumor has it that the clink of armor wasn't just heard on battlefields, but also in taverns. And sometimes, right before a full-on brawl over spilled wine or a stolen chicken leg. Could it be that some knights were less about valor and more about very drunk and ready to punch? You're in a smoky medieval tavern. The air is thick with wood smoke, roasted onions, and the unmistakable tang of cheap ale. Over in the corner, someone's trying to play a lute. Badly. At the center table, surrounded by admirers and two empty jugs, sits a knight red-faced armor, partly undone, telling a story that's clearly grown with every retelling. And then someone bumps his elbow. What happens next isn't an honor duel. It's a bar fight. It turns out that many knights, for all their oaths and noble ideals, were not paragons of restraint. Quite the opposite. When not on campaign, knights often found themselves flush with boredom. Ale and pride, a combination that led to some truly undignified moments. Let's start with the basics. Knights drank. A lot. Wine and ale were safer than water, which often contained delightful extras like sewage and dead rats, so consumption was high. But knights didn't just drink, they competed. Downing contests, toasts, and post-hunt feasts turned into boozy tournaments of their own. Sir Richard, our now somewhat infamous knight, is no exception. Off the battlefield, he's known for his iron stomach and short temper. At one feast, he once challenged a visiting Italian to an olive oil drinking match. The Italian passed out. Richard passed something less dignified under the table. Public drunkenness wasn't just tolerated, it was often expected, at least among fellow nobles. Drunken boasts, lewd songs, and occasional brawls were part of the knightly camaraderie. That said, there were limits. Vomiting on a bishop's shoes, bad form. Starting a tavern fire, worse. But a casual wrestling match with a squire over who gets the last roast duck, all in good fun. Of course, not everyone appreciated this behavior. commoners saw knights as both protectors and threats. One day, they're guarding your village. The next, they're throwing turnips at your market stall because someone called them lardy. And because knights operated under different laws, or at least more forgiving ones, they often walked away with little more than a fine or a stern talking to from a superior. There's a famous example from 1322. A knight named Baldwin de Calverley was arrested for got into a sharp disagreement at a tavern over a dice game. His punishment: he had to donate a new altar cloth to the local church and apologize during Lent. The victim, meanwhile, lost an eye and most of his dignity. It wasn't just alcohol-fueled chaos. Pride was a constant trigger. Knights carried reputations like they carried swords always within reach. A stray insult, a sideways glance, a poor choice of words during a toast, and suddenly everyone's ducking under benches as armored egos clash. Tournaments often acted as pressure valves for these tensions, not just formal jousts, but pas d'armes and informal challenges. Knights would camp beside bridges or gates, daring others to fight them for passage, all in the name of honor. But it wasn't just for sport. These events were sometimes thinly veiled excuses to settle drunken grudges from previous banquets. Some castles even had unofficial dueling grounds where knights could resolve arguments out of earshot from nobles. These weren't legal by any means, but they were tolerated. One French lord reportedly built a sandpit behind his stables specifically for his hot-headed guests to vent themselves. And then there were the tavern songs, not just chants about bravery and glory, but bawdy ballads, mocking rival knights, suggestive jabs at clergy, and dramatic reenactments of very questionable historical events. Singing loudly and off-key was a nightly pastime, especially if it made someone in the audience blush. But beneath the antics was a deeper truth. Many knights were bored. Between wars, their main job was to look important, manage land poorly, and wait for something exciting to happen. With no dragons to slay and increasingly fewer actual battles, they turned to feasting, boasting, and causing minor social collapses at banquets. Training was sporadic. Formal drills were rare, especially during peacetime. So taverns became unofficial practice grounds for conflict resolution, with predictable results. Many injuries were accidental, and some hilariously poetic. One knight fractured a rib falling off a table while reenacting a cavalry charge using a broomstick and a roast pig. Some of this behavior was tolerated because knights were at the end of the day useful. They were the muscle of the feudal system, and keeping them happy, whether through feasts, hunting privileges, or relaxed discipline, was in everyone's interest. But not everyone let things slide. Clerics frequently denounced knightly rowdiness. One 12th century monk wrote, "They come to the abbey red with wine and sin, demanding blessing with one hand while groping the kitchen boy with the other." Harsh, but not entirely inaccurate. Church leaders often tried to tame knights through peace of God, declarations, and spiritual penance. Results were mixed. In some regions, towns passed ordinances banning knights from entering with weapons or even from drinking at all. These rules were rarely enforced, but they hint at just how disruptive a knight's night out could be. Even kings weren't immune. Henry II of England once banned a group of knights from attending his Christmas court after one of them challenged the royal jester to a duel over a pun. The jester, to his credit, declined. Still, despite all the chaos, something oddly endearing clings to these tales. Yes, knights could be brutes, but they could also be heartbreakingly human, drunk, messy, insecure, desperate for glory and completely unequipped to handle a sarcastic bard with a sharp tongue. So as you drift into sleep, imagine that tavern again, the fire crackling low, a lute playing slightly out of tune, a knight helmet under his arm, arguing loudly about the size of a boar he once almost caught. He slurs a song, raises a mug, and toasts to honor before promptly falling off his bench. And maybe you smile because the past, for all its iron and parchment, still echoes with the clink of a knight's mug hitting the floor. Quick question. How do you become a knight if your dad's a pig farmer and your noble blood is thinner than the soup in a peasant's pot? Is knighthood only for the elite? Or was there a medieval loophole that let ambitious commoners sneak into the saddle? Let's clear something up right away. Not every knight was born with a golden spoon, or even a bronze one for that matter. While popular culture loves the idea of blue-blooded warriors from long dynasties of sword-swinging ancestors, the truth is more flexible. The medieval path to knighthood wasn't always paved with noble birth. Sometimes it was paved with luck, loyalty, and a whole lot of bootlicking. You meet a man named Edric. He's got a scar across his nose, dirt under every fingernail, and the kind of permanent squint that only comes from years of staring down angry livestock. His father, a stable hand. His childhood rough. But today, Edric rides under a banner, wears half-decent armor, and is addressed sometimes with a smirk as Sir. Let's start with the basics. Yes, knighthood traditionally came from noble bloodlines. Being born into the right family meant you were fast-tracked, sent off to be a page at 7, a squire at 14, and knighted around 21. You'd learn manners, swordplay, falconry, and how not to spill wine on your lord's best tunic. But this idealized path was only one route. Reality, as usual, was messier. First warfare changed everything. When conflicts flared, especially during the Crusades or border skirmishes, lords needed fighters. Fast. If you proved yourself in battle, showed loyalty, or caught the attention of a powerful noble knighthood, could be granted even if your family tree was more shrub than oak. Knighted on the field of battle wasn't just a poetic flourish, it happened. A brave soldier might save a lord's life, or hold a bridge against overwhelming odds and be dubbed on the spot, often with the lord's own sword. No paperwork, no bloodline, just guts and timing. And let's not ignore the power of wealth. Money talked. Rich merchants, successful landowners, and minor gentry could sometimes buy their way into respectability. Sponsor enough troops, donate to the church, or marry into the right family, and suddenly your son is Sir Geoffrey of Smelt on the Weald. A bit of coin greased many heraldic hinges. There were even times when kings mass-knighted entire groups for political or symbolic reasons. Edward III famously dubbed hundreds before battles to boost morale and reinforce loyalty. Did they all deserve it? Not really. But the crown needed unity, and a good knightly ceremony always looked impressive. This created tension. Old money knights sneered at the newcomers. Upstarts, they'd grumble. Fishmongers in plate. Social divisions ran deep. Tournaments sometimes refused entry to non-noble knights. Heralds quarreled over who had the right to bear arms. But over time, practical skill often overruled pedigree, especially when arrows started flying. Edric, our mud-blooded knight, earned his spurs during a messy border war. He carried messages through enemy lines, took a crossbow bolt to the thigh, and still managed to light the signal fire on a hill no one else dared climb. His reward, a hastily muttered blessing and a sword tap on both shoulders. Knighted in a thunderstorm, with half his face caked in blood and mud. He never learned Latin, could barely read. but he knew how to fight, follow orders, and command respect. Still, life wasn't easy for common-born knights. They often lacked land, meaning they relied on retainers' wages or royal favor. Their armor was second-hand, their horses slow, invitations to court events rare, and marriage prospects tricky. No noblewoman wanted to explain to her father why she was engaged to Sir Peasant-Face. Many served as household knights, part of a lord's permanent retinue. They weren't landowners, but glorified bodyguards, often tasked with managing minor estates, collecting taxes, or intimidating villagers. It was work, but not glory. And the name, that Sir, wasn't always spoken with respect. In some circles, it was more a joke than a title. Sir Coinpurse, Sir Bought and Paid, or worse. These men lived in a strange social limbo, above the peasants, below the nobles, and constantly reminded of it. But some rose. Through persistence, marriage, or heroic deeds, a few common-born knights clawed their way into genuine respectability. Their descendants might forget the pig farming origins and proudly display coats of arms with lions' eagles, or occasionally suspiciously turnip-shaped shields. The church also offered a path. Military orders, like the Knights Templar or Hospitallers, accepted recruits from varied backgrounds. Service in these orders came with vows, routines, and spiritual justification, but also status. A poor boy with zeal could become a respected warrior monk, feared and honored across Europe. Of course, there was always paperwork. By the late Middle Ages, the growing obsession with lineage led to stricter heraldic controls. If you claimed knighthood, you had to prove it. Some families faked documents or bribed heralds. Others were exposed and publicly shamed. One man was stripped of his spurs mid-tournament, a humiliation worse than being unhorsed. Still, knighthood's definition kept evolving. By the 15th century, it was less about battlefield prowess and more about court behavior. Etiquette manuals replaced sword drills. A knight might spend more time learning which fork to use at banquets than how to parry a halberd. This shift made it easier for literate, well-connected commoners to climb the ranks if they had the patience to master menus and metaphors. So next time you picture a knight in shining armor, remember that not all of them were born in castles. Some were born in barns. They weren't raised on privilege, but carved their names into history through bravery, luck, and the occasional questionable bribe. And as you drift off tonight, imagine Edric, our mud-caked knight, leaning against a tavern wall. His armor doesn't shine. His banner's a bit crooked, but he fought for his place, earned every dent. And when he's called Sir, he might smirk, shrug, and whisper, "Not bad for a stable boy." There's a curious contradiction in the stories we're told. Knights are often portrayed as holy warriors, zealously charging across the sea to reclaim sacred lands. But what if some of them really, really didn't want to go? What if crusading wasn't about piety, but pressure politics and painfully bad timing? Picture it, a summons from the king, a roaring sermon from the local bishop, and a chorus of villagers urging you to do your duty for God. But all you, a weary knight with sore knees and a half-paid mortgage on your estate, can think is, do I really have to go all the way to Jerusalem? Welcome to the uneasy relationship between knights and the Crusades. Sure, the First Crusade in 1095 fired up plenty of religious passion. Pope Urban II promised spiritual rewards, forgiveness of sins, and a golden afterlife to those who joined. The banners were raised, the horses saddled, and the hopeful trudged east. but that was the first one. By the time the second, third, or seventh crusade rolled around, enthusiasm had waned. Knights like Richard, our familiar, moderately responsible knight, weren't always so eager to pack up and leave. Why? Because crusading was expensive, dangerous, and inconvenient. And not all knights were keen to die in the desert over lands they'd never seen. Let's talk cost. A single crusade could bankrupt a knight. You had to hire servants, outfit horses, purchase passage across seas, and bribe more people than you'd think. Some knights mortgaged estates, sold off land, or begged wealthy patrons just to afford the journey. And it wasn't a quick trip. These expeditions could take years. Years away from your lands, your income, your manor's leaky roof. Absentee knights often returned to find their estates mismanaged or their political rivals quietly taking over their roles. Some returned to find wives remarried, or at least pretending to be widows for tax reasons. Then there was the weather. Many knights trained in the forests and meadows of Europe found the Middle Eastern climate brutal. Sandstorms, heat stroke, unfamiliar diseases, all while wearing steel and wool. A knight might survive a dozen skirmishes only to be taken out by dysentery in a palm grove. And don't assume every knight believed the cause was just. Some were skeptical. Others were coerced. Monarchs and lords often pressured vassals into joining crusades to avoid appearing weak. Refusal could damage your standing, or worse, lead to accusations of heresy or cowardice. There's a recorded case of one English knight, Sir Alan de Ferrers, who faked illness for 3 months to avoid joining the Fourth Crusade. When confronted, he dramatically collapsed in church only to be spotted a week later wrestling pigs at a harvest fair. Subtle, effective, surprisingly, even those who went didn't always fight. Many knights served as guards, caravan escorts, or administrators. Some spent most of their time negotiating with local leaders or managing logistics. The front lines were brutal, chaotic, and often manned by more desperate or devout crusaders. And yet, despite all the grumbling, crusading remained prestigious. Completing a crusade, even if you never saw combat, added weight to your name. You could return and style yourself a milites Christi, a soldier of Christ. Add a palm badge to your cloak, maybe a cross tattoo on your arm, and suddenly your dinner invitations doubled. Some knights went for opportunity, not piety. The Crusades opened up routes for trade land acquisition and political advancement. If you played your cards right, you could carve out a domain in the Levant or marry into local nobility. Others simply used the journey to escape debt scandals or inconvenient family feuds. Of course, there were those who did believe. Zealous knights who saw the Crusades as a sacred mission. They prayed, fasted, wept at relics, and marched barefoot into battle. But even among the devout, disillusionment crept in. The sacking of Christian cities, the infighting among leaders, and the brutal treatment of locals led many to question what exactly they were fighting for. Let's not forget the infamous Fourth Crusade, where the Crusaders, originally bound for the Holy Land, ended up besieging and looting Constantinople instead. Christian attacking Christian, all in the name of funding a campaign they never completed. One knight wrote home, "We have done God's work." Sideways. For those who returned, reintegration wasn't always smooth. Crusaders came back aged, injured, and sometimes traumatized. They carried stories of wonders and horrors of deserts that sang of cities, burning of fellow knights, lost to arrow heat or betrayal. Some found their old lives didn't fit anymore, and some didn't return at all. Tombs were raised across Europe for knights buried thousands of miles away. bones left to dust in forgotten fields. Their names remembered more as legends than people. Songs were sung, tapestries woven, but often by those who had stayed behind, spinning heroism out of half-truths and hearsay. Richard, for his part, did go. Pressured by his liege and guilted by his chaplain, he set sail reluctantly. He survived barely, returned with fewer teeth, more scars, and a vague dislike of olives. He doesn't talk about it much, just stares at the fire sometimes, turning a chipped cross pendant between calloused fingers. And maybe that's the real story behind so many crusading knights. Not zealots, not heroes. Just tired men caught between duty and doubt, honor and horror. Some went for glory, others went because they were told to, and a few, just a few went because they believed. So tonight, if your dreams drift eastward, don't picture the triumphant knight atop a dune. Picture the one at the back of the caravan muttering about sand in his boots, worrying about taxes back home, and wondering if God's blessing included sunburn. Here's a puzzler. What did some knights do when there were no wars to fight, no tournaments to win, and no lords to impress? What if being a full-time warrior actually meant finding side gigs just to pay the bills? When the trumpets fall silent and the banners come down, what's a knight to do? Contrary to popular belief, knights weren't on permanent crusade schedules or stuck in endless tournaments. The truth, they often had a surprising amount of downtime and a surprising need for income. Let's revisit Sir Richard. After the exhausting crusade, his armor is scratched, his purse is thin, and the local feast circuit has grown tired of his tales. So he does what many medieval knights did. When peace settled in, like an unwanted dinner guest, he takes on some extra jobs. Yes, knights had side hustles. Not all were glamorous. Sure, some lucky ones held lands with productive manors, loyal tenants, and healthy yields. But many didn't. Maybe they inherited too little. Maybe they lost it in a feud. Or maybe they spent it on tournament wagers and embroidery for their third favorite horse. Whatever the reason, they needed coin and fast. So what did they do? Some became tax collectors for their lords. Imagine it, a fully armored knight arriving at your village not to defend it, but to collect grain chickens and silver pennies on behalf of the crown. These weren't friendly visits. Peasants dreaded the knock. Knights were known to round up owed amounts or invent debts entirely. Others became castle stewards or land managers. They weren't swinging swords, they were balancing books, inspecting crop rotations, and yelling at that one lazy reeve who always mysteriously disappeared during sheep shearing season. It wasn't glorious work, but it paid. Still others hired themselves out as muscle. They served as enforcers for wealthy merchants, escorted traveling nobles, or even guarded churches during relic displays. Pilgrims apparently got rowdy. One German knight, out of cash, guarded a cabbage merchant's caravan from thieves for 3 weeks and was paid in pickled turnips and a surprisingly nice goat. And then there were the tournament junkies. Tournaments weren't just sport, they were business. Knights traveled from city to city like jousting rock stars, hoping to win purses, impress patrons, or just get free meals. Some made a decent living this way, though the injuries were frequent. One knight reportedly broke his collarbone nose and pried in 3 consecutive jousts, but still managed to marry the brewer's daughter in the end. A few knights dabbled in writing. Yes, really. Literacy among knights wasn't universal, but those who could read and write often turned to poetry chronicles or letters, especially when war stories aged like old cheese. Some became ghostwriters for noble families, penning flattering histories or love poems under someone else's name. A knight with a quill was rare but valuable. Some leaned into religious life without becoming monks. They joined military orders like the Knights Hospitaller, which functioned as a mix of Army Hospital Corps and real estate management firm. These knights served both sword and scripture, living under vows, but still enjoying prestige. Others simply funded chapels or sponsored pilgrimages to stay spiritually active without giving up their wine. And then, of course, came the mercenary life. When peace in one region dragged on, some knights sought out war elsewhere. They crossed borders, joined foreign armies, or banded together into free companies, roving bands of hired swords who fought for whoever had coin. These groups were both feared and frowned upon. Sometimes they protected towns. Sometimes they burned towns. Depends on who paid more. One infamous group, the White Company in Italy, was led by a British knight named John Hawkwood. His men fought for rival city-states, switched sides often, and once negotiated a ceasefire in exchange for 10,000 florins and a public banquet. Hawkwood became a celebrity mercenary, a walking contradiction of chivalry and ruthless profit. Back home, not all knights could stomach the mercenary path. Some tried crafts or trade, investing in vineyards, mills, or shipping ventures. A few even married wealthy widows and lived comfortably as retired warriors, though they were occasionally dragged out to pose dramatically at village festivals or bless local babies with mildly terrifying gauntleted fingers. The truth is, knighthood wasn't a job with a fixed schedule. It was a title, and titles don't always pay rent. Unless you were landed gentry, you had to hustle. Even landed knights struggled with bad harvests, rising costs, and that one cousin who kept borrowing from the family coffer. And while we often think of knights as above money, many were deeply in debt. Armor needed replacing. Horses needed feeding. Castles needed roofing. Debts mounted. Some knights mortgaged their lands multiple times. Others pawned their armor. A few fled entirely, becoming outlaws or joining monasteries just to escape creditors. Still, there was dignity in labor, at least among the practical. Richard, for example, took on a position teaching swordplay to the sons of a local baron. 3 hours a day, 6 days a week. It paid well enough, and he grew fond of the youngest boy, who had a knack for slipping under taller opponents and poking them with surprising accuracy. Richard also perhaps half-seriously started writing down his war stories in the back of a ledger meant for tax records. He still wore his armor to town festivals, still got invited to important dinners. But now, between tales of battle, he answered questions about sheep taxes and fencing footwork, and oddly, it suited him. So as you drift off tonight, don't just picture the knight mid-charge or mid-feast. Picture him counting coins, herding reluctant students into a practice yard, or trading poems with a shy noblewoman who smells faintly of ink and cinnamon. Because for every tale of war and glory, there's a quieter one of knights just trying to keep the pantry stocked and the wine flowing. Not all knight training involves swords, shields, and stern-faced masters. Some of it involved geese, wooden pigs, and the occasional broom horse. How exactly did young squires prepare for war, and why did it sometimes look more like medieval summer camp than military academy? You're 7 years old, standing in a courtyard with oversized gloves, your feet wrapped in scratchy wool, and an uncooperative chicken tucked under one arm. Welcome to night school. It's not quite the noble montage you expected. Despite the epic legends of knightly training, the early stages of a knight's education were often as absurd as they were essential. Forget long hours of swordplay and heroic speeches. In reality, the path to knighthood began with chores, clumsiness, and a lot of bruised egos and shins. Let's start from the beginning. Noble boys usually became pages around age 7. That meant leaving home to live with another noble family, often allies or relatives. It wasn't exile, but it wasn't exactly voluntary either. It was more like being traded for experience, etiquette, and a shot at future advancement. As a page, you didn't start with weapons. You started with laundry and floor scrubbing and warming benches before your lord sat down. You cleaned armor, fetched goblets, carried messages, and learned when to speak rarely and when to nod politely always. But in between, serving trenchers and dodging grumpy dogs, pages absorbed the rhythms of noble life. They listened to court stories, learned table manners, studied basic Latin religious texts, and if lucky, how to read household accounts. Some were taught to play instruments or compose simple verse, a sort of chivalric multi-tool charm. Grace and literacy all rolled into one. Then came the animals. Pages cared for dogs, hawks, and horses. They learned how to saddle, groom, feed, and soothe them. Handling animals taught patience, strength, and the fine art of avoiding kicks to the ribs. Horseplay wasn't discouraged. It was homework. When they hit their early teens, pages became squires. Now things got serious. Squires trained directly under knights. They learned to polish weapons, carry shields, and assist in dressing their master for battle or tournaments. They also finally got to wield practice swords, often made of wood and far too heavy, and spar in controlled chaos with other squires. But combat training wasn't all majestic lunges and noble parries. Squires trained using hay bales, dummies, and even rotating devices with padded arms designed to knock them over if they weren't fast enough. One such contraption, the quintain, spun. When struck, if you didn't duck, you got whacked. Great fun for spectators, less so for your pride. They also practiced wrestling, swimming, and mock battles. Some even trained using livestock. There are scattered accounts of boys riding goats or chasing chickens blindfolded as agility drills. It wasn't standardized, but it was effective and occasionally hilarious. Still, the path wasn't just about muscles. A squire had to manage horses' mend gear and track supplies. They shadowed their knight into war zones, acting as assistant scouts and first-line medics. They watched their mentors bleed, win, lose, and sometimes die. It was a front-row seat to both glory and consequence. Discipline was strict. Mistakes meant more chores. Defiance meant punishment. One lord, reportedly, made a squire sleep outside in winter for polishing his helm with pig fat instead of oil. Another tied a boy's boots to a barrel for arriving late to chapel. Harsh, yes, but it drilled humility into the proud. And yet squires also bonded. They competed, joked, and supported each other. Many lifelong friendships and rivalries were born in dusty yards, during awkward sparring sessions, or shared nightmares after a long day of training, followed by a goose chase, literally. When a squire proved himself, typically between ages 18 and 21, he might be knighted. The ceremony varied. Sometimes it was formal, a night-long vigil in a chapel, a symbolic bath prayers, blessings, and a solemn dubbing with a sword. Other times, it was mid-battle, bloody rushed, and very dramatic. But not everyone made it. Some squires quit. Some were dismissed. Others died in training accidents. And a few simply didn't have the resources or patronage to continue. The process was rigorous, and the stakes were high, not just personally, but socially. So, where do chickens come in? Aside from being agility trainers and mess makers, they were also occasionally part of initiation pranks. Older squires sent younger ones on ridiculous errands, fetch the feathered lance, capture the dual rooster, or locate Sir Cluxalot. If the boy asked too many questions, he was branded hopeless. If he returned with a chicken and a story, he had potential. These stories, true or not, paint a fuller picture. Knightly training wasn't all solemnity and swordlight. It was dusty, noisy, occasionally ridiculous, and deeply human. Sir Richard once told a tale after some wine of a squire duel fought entirely with wet laundry. Another involved a bet to mount a sheep bareback, which ended with 3 broken dishes, 1 confused shepherd, and a permanent ban from the manor's west garden. And despite all that they learned, through bruises and blisters, through humiliation and hard-earned praise, pages and squires slowly became knights, not just in skill, but in endurance observation, and the ability to carry someone else's helmet without complaining too much. Tonight, as you drift off, imagine that training yard under a gray sky. 2 boys sparring, one sneezing from hay dust, the other trying not to laugh. In the corner, a chicken watches silent, judgmental, and slightly offended by its unexpected role in history. Because sometimes greatness starts not with a sword, but with a broom horse, a bucket, and a surprisingly fast goose. Imagine this. You're expected to serenade your best friend's wife with poetry, offer her tokens of affection, and pledge your undying devotion, all while promising never to actually act on it. Sounds romantic, or like emotional chaos wrapped in velvet. Welcome to the world of courtly love, where flirting was practically a profession. You're in a candlelit hall, harp music wafting through the air, sweet wine on your tongue, and across the room sits the lady of the manor. She's not your wife. You're not her husband. But you just handed her a silk ribbon and called her the moonlight of your weary soul. Congratulations, you're officially tangled in the bizarre web of medieval romance. Courtly love wasn't a private matter. It was practically a public sport. And for knights, it was part of the job description. As if charging into battle managing land and not suffocating in armor weren't enough, they were also expected to master the fine art of wooing a lady they could never truly have. Let's back up. The concept of courtly love emerged in the 12th century, especially in southern France and northern Italy. Inspired by troubadour poetry and Arthurian legend, it framed love as noble, spiritual, and crucially unattainable. A knight would devote himself to a high-born lady, sing her praises, write her poems, perform feats in her honor, and never ever consummate the relationship. That was the theory. In practice, things got complicated. For one, many of these ladies were already married to powerful lords, often the knight's own patron. The love was supposed to be platonic, a kind of moral exercise in restraint and idealism. But we are, after all, talking about humans, bored, ambitious, frequently intoxicated humans. Affairs happened. So did scandals. One letter from a monastery laments that the Knight of Crimson Banner hath beguiled the Lady of Combe, and now her husband seeks vengeance with much noise. That noise, likely the sound of a barn being set on fire. Yet the ideal persisted. Knights learned to compose, verses memorize flattering metaphors, and praise their lady's eyes, hair, or embroidered sleeve with maddening devotion. A knight might wear her colors into battle. He might carve her initials into his shield. He might even, if particularly bold, send her a poem comparing her to a falcon rose or the Virgin Mary, depending on his risk appetite. The poems themselves were elaborate. One knight compared his lady's voice to spring rain upon a silver harp. Another, less successful, described a noble woman's laugh as the bleating of a lamb blessed by angels. She never replied. And while most of these declarations were harmless, they could stir real tension. Imagine being a nobleman, watching a young knight twirl around your wife with a lute and a bouquet. Even if you trusted her, did you trust him? Or his fellow poets? Some courts encouraged it, especially those with literary flair. Eleanor of Aquitaine's court is famously linked to courtly love traditions fostering troubadours and poetic contests. There were even written rules of love, like jealousy increases true love, and a new love puts to flight an old one. Useful if you enjoy drama, but courtly love didn't stay confined to poetry. It seeped into real expectations. Knights began crafting their reputations not just on battlefield valor, but on romantic entanglements. A knight who won a tournament for his lady's favor gained social capital. One who failed in love or worse, lacked a lady, might be mocked. Of course, not everyone participated. Some knights grumbled that love distracted from duty. Others feared scandal. One famously crusty baron reportedly declared, "The only lady I need is my sword, and she doesn't speak in riddles." Charming. And the ladies. Their experiences varied. Some wielded courtly love like a weapon, politely collecting admirers, manipulating alliances, and enjoying the attention without ever risking their position. Others hated the performance, the pressure, and the wandering hands that sometimes came with poetic compliments. Still, there were exceptions, couples who turned ritual into reality. One squire wrote love letters daily to his patron's daughter. She wrote back. They eloped. Her father sent 10 knights after them. Only 7 returned. Their story became a ballad, mostly because it ended with a duel in a pumpkin patch and an unexpected pig stampede. The church, predictably, wasn't thrilled about courtly love. While promoting spiritual love and restraint sounded good, the potential for sin lurked around every sonnet. Preachers warned of carnal poetry and love that slides from metaphor to sin as easily as butter on a hot trencher. Yet the songs kept flowing. So did the games. Courtly love inspired pageants, mock trials of love, and even romantic duels. 2 knights might fight not for land or honor, but to prove who loved a lady more. Sometimes the lady judged the winner. Other times she declared both foolish and walked away with someone smarter. As ridiculous as it sounds, courtly, love shaped knighthood as much as swords and sieges. It taught poise, persuasion, and the power of words. It gave knights a stage beyond the battlefield and reminded them that even warriors could be poets, or at least passable lyricists with questionable metaphors. Sir Richard. He once wrote a poem about a baroness's eyebrows that made it halfway to legend before it was revealed he plagiarized it from a baker's apprentice. He still claims the rhythm was improved. So tonight, as you settle into sleep, think not only of clangs and battles, but whispered verses, awkward serenades, and knights trying desperately to rhyme damsel with hands full. Because even in a world of mud and steel, someone always finds time to flirt with or without permission. You'd expect warriors clad in armor to look dignified, but what if knights sometimes dressed more like overstuffed peacocks than seasoned veterans? What if fashion, not function, ruled the battlefield, the ballroom, and everything in between. It's a brisk spring morning, and Sir Richard is getting dressed. Not for battle, not for a hunt, but for court. He's been invited to a noble gathering, a rare chance to be seen, heard, and hopefully remembered. And so he stands before a carved wooden chest, pondering which pair of tights best matches his doublet. Because yes, medieval knights cared deeply, painfully, even comically about fashion. Let's set the record straight. Knights weren't always striding around in gleaming plate armor. Most of the time, they wore courtly clothes, rich fabrics, gaudy colors, and enough embroidery to terrify a modern tailor. And while some of it was genuinely stylish, a lot of it was questionable. Take the houppelande, for example, a robe-like garment with wide sleeves so long they dragged on the ground. Knights wore them belted high at the waist, sometimes trimmed with fur, sometimes lined with silk. Elegant, yes. Practical, not in the slightest. Tripping over your own sleeve while trying to bow wasn't just likely, it was expected. Then came the colors: bright pinks, deep purples, acid greens. The richer and more garish, the better. Wearing saffron-dyed linen or imported blue from Indigo Fera Tinctoria wasn't just a style choice, it was a financial flex. These dyes were rare and expensive. If you could afford to look like a flamboyant tapestry, you were somebody. Patterns were bold. Think stripes, diamonds, and heraldic beasts sprawled across tunics. Some knights even wore garments divided straight down the middle, one side scarlet, the other mustard yellow, like a living chessboard of questionable decisions. And then there were the shoes. Ah, poulaines, the infamous pointy shoes with toes so long they needed to be tied to the knees. Popular in the 14th and 15th centuries, these shoes weren't just stylish, they were a hazard. Knights tripped on them, fell downstairs, and got them tangled in horse stirrups. The church denounced them. Kings tried to ban them. Knights wore them anyway. Some took fashion into their armor, commissioning engraved breastplates, gilded gauntlets, or visors shaped like animal faces. One knight reportedly had a helmet fashioned to resemble a snarling lion. Another requested a helm in the shape of a sunflower, though records are vague on whether it was worn more than once. Even weapons became accessories. Sword hilts were decorated with jewels. Scabbards were embossed with love poems or family mottos. One knight had his dagger inlaid with pearls that spelled out "strike true," but not too often a sentiment both philosophical and slightly suspicious. Let's not forget about hats. Knights wore feathered caps, floppy berets, and wide-brimmed bicockets that made them look like well-dressed mushrooms. Feathers were often dyed bright blue or orange. The taller the plume, the greater the ego. At one royal wedding, two knights got into an argument over whose hat was taller. The matter was settled with a foot race which neither finished due to excessive laughter and tripping. And underneath it all, lacy underthings. Not lace like modern lingerie, but linen undergarments trimmed with decorative edging. Wealthy knights often had personal tailors craft-fitted undershirts and braise medieval underwear that were both comfortable and quietly ostentatious. Embroidery near the hem. No one would see it, but you'd know it was there. That was enough. These fashion statements weren't frivolous. Clothing communicated status, allegiance, wealth, and even mood. A knight's outfit could signal mourning, black velvet restrained trims, celebration, gold thread, bells sewn into sleeves, or flirtation low necklines, not just for ladies paired with fitted hose that left little to the imagination. There were even sumptuary rules about who could wear what. Only nobles above certain ranks could wear cloth of gold, certain furs, or elaborate brooches. Knights who broke these rules risked fine scandal or being laughed at by heralds during court functions. But knights didn't always obey. Sir Richard once wore a coat lined with forbidden ermine, claiming it was well-fed rabbit. No one believed him. He was fined 2 silver groats and banned from the feast. He ate outside with the servants and reportedly had a better time anyway. Of course, fashion had regional flair. In France, knights leaned toward velvet and tight sleeves. In Italy, slashed garments revealed bright layers beneath. In Germany, padded doublets made wearers look like muscular songbirds. English knights preferred wide collars, long cloaks, and grumbling about how silly everyone else looked. Not every knight embraced the trend. Some opted for practicality, sturdy wool, modest coats, boots built for walking, rather than impressing. These were often older knights, or those who'd learned the hard way that shoes tied to your knees don't help in bar fights. But even the plainest knight dressed up eventually. Ceremonies demanded it. Feasts required it. And heaven help you, if you underdressed at a royal event, you'd be remembered forever as Sir Drab of no fun. And despite the awkwardness, knights took pride in their appearance. Looking sharp wasn't vanity, it was part of the image. People respected what they could see. A knight in shining silk, with an engraved scabbard and a too-long feathered hat, might not win every duel, but he'd certainly be talked about afterward. Tonight, as you fade into sleep, picture Sir Richard at his mirror, adjusting his belt for the 10th time, squinting at his reflection, wondering if his left boot looks more burgundy than intended. He's already been knighted. He's already survived battles. But tonight's real challenge, matching his sash to his surcoat without looking like a jester. Because sometimes, true courage means wearing magenta in front of the queen. Let's flip the script. What happens when a knight decides he's had enough of glory armor and noble banquets? What if instead of dying in battle, he simply walks away? Why did some knights choose silence over swordplay? And how did the world treat them for it? It's early morning mist curling through the hills, and a lone rider dismounts near an abbey gate. He's not here for confession, or a feast, or a favor. He carries no lance, no banners, no demands. Just a small satchel, a patched cloak, and a sword he's about to give up forever. Because, believe it or not, some knights quit. They didn't all die in battle or retire to sprawling estates. A surprising number simply stepped away from the whole chivalric enterprise, turning in their arms and adopting lives of prayer poverty or quiet labor. And their reasons as varied and human as you'd expect. Some were disillusioned. Years of warfare, betrayal, and political scheming wore thin even the bravest souls. Crusades that went nowhere, tournaments rigged for the highest bidder, and lords who cared more about appearances than justice, it all added up. For every glorious tale, there were a dozen silent traumas. Some knights, after enough bloodshed, wanted peace that couldn't be bought with a sword. Others were broken physically or emotionally. Injuries that never healed. Battles that left them limping scarred or blind in one eye. Without the strength to fight, or the funds to maintain status, knighthood became an empty title. Rather than clinging to fading glory, they chose humility. Monasteries offered an answer. Monastic life wasn't easy, but for many it was a refuge. Knights traded their war horses for quiet cloisters, their weapons for prayer books. They took vows, grew herbs, copied manuscripts, and reflected on their past. It wasn't penance for all, but it was penance for some. Sir Richard knew one such man, Sir Alric of Baymore. Once a fierce tourney champion, Alric vanished after a brutal siege. Months later, he reappeared, wearing a monk's robe, his sword melted into a candlestick, now used during evening mass. He never spoke of what happened at the siege, just rang the bell at dawn, every day, for 40 years. Not every departure was spiritual. Some knights turned mercenary, then retired to quiet villages, pretending they were never nobility. Others fled scandals, illegitimate children, political blunders, debts that no title could erase. A knight might vanish from court and reappear as a miller, a brewer, or even a schoolteacher. Records blur and legends take over. Family often played a role. Some quit to care for aging parents, widowed sisters, or orphaned nephews. One knight left his post to raise a daughter after her mother died in childbirth. He never fought again, but he did teach her to read ride and shoot a bow straighter than most squires. And sometimes it was love. Not courtly poetic love, but real inconvenient scandalous love. Love that couldn't exist within the rigid ladder of feudal expectation. A knight might fall for a merchant's daughter, a foreign traveler, or someone already married. To preserve them both, he walked away. He'd rather live free and unknown than famous and hollow. There's a common thread in these stories: control. Knighthood, for all its glory, was rigid. Rules, roles, expectations. Your clothes, your speech, your public actions, all carefully curated. Walking away wasn't weakness. It was reclamation. A quiet rebellion against a life defined by everyone else. But society didn't always understand. Some viewed these ex-knights as mad, disgraced, or selfish. Their names were erased from ledgers, their heraldry scraped off family tombs. Chronicles rarely mention them, and yet you'll find their echoes in local records, small donations to churches' land deeds, signed by former knight, or poems written in a careful hand beside a barley harvest receipt. There's even a story, half true, half whispered, of a knight who built a chapel out of battlefield scrap. Shields as roofing spears as beams. He invited no one, said no prayers, just sat inside it every evening, watching the sun set through an arrow-slit window he carved himself. Knighthood was never just a profession. It was identity. Stepping away meant redefining everything: who you were, what mattered, and how you wanted to be remembered. Some took their stories with them. Others passed them on quietly around fires in barnyards, at candlelit desks, where they taught grandsons how to hold a quill instead of a blade. Sir Richard once joked that if he ever retired, he'd open a bakery and name every loaf after a lost battle. Croissant of Crécy, muffin of Metz, the baguette of betrayal. No one took him seriously. But then again, no one's seen him bake yet. So tonight, as you rest beneath imagined stars, think of those who set down their swords, not in defeat, but in clarity, who chose soft bells over war horns, warm bread over iron, and the kind of peace no victory could ever buy. Because sometimes the bravest thing a knight can do is walk away. Think you know King Arthur Camelot and the Round Table. What if those bedtime stories and shiny legends were already suspect 1,000 years ago? Could medieval knights have been chasing fantasies written by poets, not historians? The torches flicker in the great hall. Somewhere, a minstrel begins to strum a soft tune. Around you, knights sip mead and lean closer, not for battle plans or estate gossip, but for stories. And more often than not, those stories begin with, "in the days of King Arthur." Because even in the Middle Ages, people were obsessed with myths. Let's be clear, Arthurian legend wasn't just entertainment. It was a full-blown cultural phenomenon, a medieval media franchise with knights as its core fans. And like all fandoms, it blurred the line between fact and fantasy until even real knights weren't sure which parts were true and which were just really well written. By the 12th century, stories of Arthur, Lancelot Gawain, and Guinevere were everywhere. From castles to village squares, people knew the names, the quests, the betrayals. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia kicked things off, but it was Chrétien de Troyes and other poets who turned Arthur's court into a dramatic, romantic, and oddly French version of heroism. Knights weren't just listening, they were imitating. They adopted the ideals of the round table loyalty, courage, courtesy. They modeled their behavior on fictional characters. Some even claimed lineage from Arthurian knights, proudly announcing descent from Sir Gawain or Percival, as if that made them better at jousting or morally superior in love triangles. Tournaments were named after legendary duels. Feasts featured round tables where guests sat in a circle, each pretending to be a legendary knight. It wasn't cosplay, it was validation. If Arthur's knights were the gold standard, then any echo of them made real knights feel larger than life. And that was part of the problem. The legends were clean, structured, morally tidy. Real life. Not so much. Chivalry in the stories meant rescuing damsels, slaying dragons, and upholding justice. Chivalry in real life often meant enforcing taxes, squashing rebellions, and wondering if that damsel was just after your horse. The disparity led to awkward moments. One knight famously tried to replicate the Grail quest by wandering into the woods with no food, no map, and a broken compass. He was found 3 days later, ankle-deep in a stream, swearing at a squirrel. Another challenged a bishop to single combat over a debate about Excalibur's authenticity. The bishop declined, yet despite the absurdities, the myths endured. Kings used them to inspire loyalty. Poets used them to critique society. Knights used them to distract from mud boredom and the grinding machinery of feudal life. Some believed. Others rolled their eyes. Sir Richard. He loved the stories, but never quite trusted them. He once claimed to have seen the round table hidden behind a tavern in York. He described it in great detail: oakwood surface, 12 golden goblets, 1 unpaid bar tab. Whether he was joking or not, no one could ever tell. Still, the impact of myth ran deep. Some knights performed acts of showy generosity, freeing prisoners, forgiving debts, donating to churches not out of duty, but because they imagined themselves as modern-day Galahads. Others named their children after legendary heroes. One particularly enthusiastic baron named his sons Arthur, Lancelot, Tristan, and confusingly, Kevin. And yes, there were dragons, or rather reports of them. Villagers sometimes claimed that a winged beast had taken livestock only to be driven off by a noble knight. Most of these dragons were likely oversized lizards, dramatic pigs, or once a runaway banner caught in the wind. But the tales stuck. There were even relics of the legend swords said to be Excalibur goblets marketed as the Grail, or shields rumored to have belonged to Arthur himself. They were passed between nobles, like celebrity autographs. One count proudly displayed Arthur's hairbrush. It was actually a porcupine. So why did the myths matter so much? Because they gave meaning, structure, hope. They turned brutal reality into romantic purpose. A starving peasant might still believe that a just knight would appear. A tired soldier might fight harder, believing he was following an ancient tradition. And a lonely knight might find comfort in imagining he was part of a grand eternal story. Of course, not everyone bought in. Scholars whispered that Arthur never existed, that the legends were stitched together from older myths, Roman warlords, and wishful thinking. But try telling that to a knight who just painted a red dragon on his shield and named his horse Camelot. Because whether or not Arthur was real, what he represented was the dream of order, of justice, of a code worth living, or at least pretending for. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, imagine the hall again. A young squire stares into the fire, clutching a wooden sword, dreaming of quests yet to come. Outside, rain patters on stone. Inside, a bard sings softly of a king who may never have lived, but who still shapes the dreams of those who do. Before you picture a knight's final moment as a glorious charge or a grand farewell, ask yourself, what if it ended in debt mud and a horse that refused to cooperate? What did the last chapter really look like for most medieval knights? The wind is cold, the saddle creaks, and Sir Richard knows this might be the last time he rides into battle. But there's no swelling music, no tearful farewell, no glimmering banner waving in slow motion. There's mud in his boot, the beginnings of a toothache, and a sharp pain in his left knee that's been acting up since that jousting accident 5 winters ago. The end of a knight's life was often not what the songs promised. For all the tales of heroic last stands and noble deaths in gleaming armor, most knights met their end in far less cinematic fashion. Many died, not with a sword in hand, but in a sickbed, a debtor's cell, or alone on a damp battlefield no one bothered to name. Some fell during minor skirmishes, local feuds, border patrols, or disputes over sheep. One unlucky knight was famously gored by a drunken boar during what was supposed to be a celebratory hunt. His shield was polished, his helmet crested. His last words were reportedly, "Is the soup ready?" Others faded slowly. Battle wounds never healed properly. Infection set in. Arthritis crept into sword arms. Vision blurred. A knight might try to maintain appearances, ride in parades, attend courts, but eventually the weight of years caught up. Armor no longer fit. Horses seemed higher than they used to. Squires had to help them off the saddle. And then came the money problems. Knighthood was expensive. Without steady land income or generous patrons, knights sank into debt. Loans were taken. Armor was pawned. Horses sold. Some knights found themselves owing more to their tailors than their blacksmiths. One notorious ledger lists a knight as deceased still owing £3 for feathered hat, 1 goose, and 2 flagons of wine. The church offered solace. Some knights arranged elaborate funerals, complete with banners, chants, and carved effigies showing them in full regalia, eternally youthful, eternally armed. These images masked the truth many had not fought in years. Some hadn't walked without a cane. Others left no monument at all. A simple burial under an unmarked stone, perhaps a sword laid across the grave, if the family could afford it. In some cases, just a whispered name in a monk's journal. Sir Alwyn died in sleep winter storm. Buried near oak. There were final battles too, of course. But even those were messier than myth suggests. Sir Richard's last campaign wasn't a legendary crusade or kingdom-defining war. It was a dispute over a river toll. A rival lord refused to pay. Lines were drawn. Knights were summoned. Mud turned to ice. Arrows flew in fog. No one wrote a song about it. He fought bravely, as he always did. But as he fell, slipping on a frozen patch of field unable to rise in time, He didn't think of glory. He thought of his sister Alianor's stew, the way his horse snorted when annoyed, and that terrible poem he once wrote, comparing a lady's eyes to pickled onions. He survived that battle barely, but he never wrote again. Returned home limping, coughing quieter. He spent his last days writing letters he never sent, polishing his old sword with a cloth he kept for ceremonial purposes, and trying to train a pigeon to carry messages it failed. And when he passed peacefully one spring night, his squire buried him beside the orchard under a tree he'd planted in his youth. No armor, no fanfare, just a stone, with his name a sprig of rosemary and a single carved line. He laughed more than he fought. Because in the end, that's the truth most stories skip. Knights weren't statues or symbols. They were people, funny flawed, tired, proud, confused, and stubbornly hopeful. Their lives weren't always glorious, and their deaths weren't always epic. But they lived fully within their strange, muddy, wine-soaked, occasionally poetic world. As you rest your eyes, let go of the myth. Picture instead a quiet orchard, a breeze through the trees, and a sword no longer raised, no longer needed, leaning gently against the roots of a tree planted by a knight who once dreamed of dragons but was content with apples. Forget what you've seen in movies. This isn't a tale of constant battle or endless honor. No, you're slipping quietly into the daily routines of knights who, among other things, talked to their swords, pampered their falcons, and considered meat a food group unto itself. Your eyes crack open before dawn, not because of any rooster or sunlight, those are for peasants, but because your day begins with ritual. You're not just any soldier. You're a knight, which means your morning involves as much ceremony as a bishop's coronation. Your squire stumbles in first, probably still half asleep himself, carrying a pail of cold water. No privacy. He's here to help you wash, pray, and gear up for what's bound to be another day of elaborate absurdity. First up, prayers. Before you even strap on a boot, you kneel on a thin wool mat in your drafty chamber and mutter Latin invocations. You're not just praying for safety in battle. No, you're also asking for clean weather, your horse's health, and that Sir Reginald finally loses a joust, spiritual and petty all at once. Then comes grooming knight style. Your beard is trimmed with a dagger, yes, a real one, because razors are for barbers, and you wouldn't be caught dead in a barber's chair. Meanwhile, your squire polishes your armor in the corner, rubbing it with a cloth soaked in vinegar and ashes. Historians still argue whether the ash was for shine or superstition, but either way, it gets in your nostrils. You sneeze, and your squire apologizes profusely. Classic morning. By now, the castle's coming alive. The cooks lighting fires in the great hall, chambermaids are groaning over laundry, and somewhere a rooster does crow. Late as usual. You eat nothing yet. That comes after your stretching routine. Yes, knight stretched. You roll your shoulders, practice drawing your sword a few times, and do a few awkward lunges in padded leggings. They chafe. No one talks about the chafing. Next comes the gear ritual. Every strap and buckle is tested by your squire. He murmurs the names of each piece as he checks them, vambrace, couter, gauntlet. Like a sacred chant. You nod solemnly as if you haven't heard this every day since you were 14. Your sword is placed before you, on the oaken table, its hilt gleaming, its edge freshly whetted. You touch it reverently. Knights believed in the spirit of their blades. Yours is named Thornsinger. You're not quite sure why, but it sounds impressive. You finally break your fast with a cup of watered wine and a heel of bread. It's not luxurious, but you've got to keep light until after drills. You're already sweating under layers of quilted linen and chainmail. As you make your way down the stone steps, a servant scurries out of your path mumbling an apology. You nod regally, knowing full well you'll trip on your own sword belt by the third stair. Outside, the training yard smells of damp earth and horse sweat. You join your fellow knights in residence, each of whom looks equally groggy and equally overdressed. The drill master bellows commands. The air is thick with clanging steel and muttered curses. Somewhere a page faints under the weight of a helmet. This is your morning, regimented, reverent, ridiculous. A night's dawn is not gentle, it's orchestrated. Between prayers, polished posture, and pretense, you've already completed more rituals before breakfast than most modern CEOs do in a week, and you haven't even touched your sword in combat yet. But that's coming soon. For now, you return inside armor, scuffed sweat-drenched, and somehow still hungry. Time for the first real meal of the day. And spoiler alert, it involves meat. Lots and lots of it. You ever wonder what it would feel like to eat 6 different animals before midday on purpose? To start your morning with a roasted boar leg and end it with pigeon pie, all while sneering at a carrot like it personally insulted your lineage. Welcome to the medieval knight's menu, where meat isn't just dinner, it's an identity. By the time your armor is scraped clean and your limbs have stopped aching from sword drills, you're ready for your proper meal. This isn't your average breakfast. It's more like a protein-packed theatrical event. In fact, breakfast is a peasant term. You're not even sure knights called it that. It was just the meal, and it started with one principle more meat. Picture this. You're seated at a long wooden table with high-backed chairs, your squire standing dutifully behind you. The table creaks under the weight of trenchers, flat stale bread used as makeshift plates piled with slices of cold mutton, boiled goose-roasted rabbit, and something that might be venison but smells oddly fishy. Historians still argue whether knights could distinguish their game from their poultry, or whether they even cared. Vegetables. Not unless they've been cooked in pork fat and garnished with shredded chicken. Greens were considered weak, possibly suspicious. You remember your uncle once got mocked into silence for bringing a parsnip salad to a feast. He never recovered socially. There's a jug of ale to wash it all down. Yes, in the morning. Ale is considered safer than water, which is often filled with mystery bacteria and the occasional frog. The ale is lukewarm, slightly bitter, and definitely stronger than anything your doctor would approve. You sip it anyway, because hydration is important, even if it comes with a buzz. By mid-meal, you're halfway through a platter of beef ribs when your neighbor knight, Sir Lionel, starts telling a story about a time he ate an entire swan. Not just the breast meat, the entire swan. He describes the feathers getting caught in his teeth. You laugh, but then remember, he's probably not joking. Swan was considered a delicacy, along with peacock and porpoise. Yes, porpoise. That was the fish of choice for holy days, because monks had ruled through some theological gymnastics that aquatic mammals counted as seafood. Problem solved. To be fair, knights were athletes in their own lumpy metal-clad way. They needed calories. Between jousting patrols and the sheer energy it took to drag around 60 pounds of armor, a steady diet of protein and fat kept them functioning. Sort of. You're also probably constipated 3 days out of 5, but medieval medicine says that's just your humors being stoic. You stab your knife a small eating dagger, nothing flashy, into a slice of blood sausage. This one's seasoned with cloves and sage because even in this meat-fueled world, flavor matters. A kitchen boy replaces your bread trencher. The old one, now soaked with meat drippings, will be given to a beggar or fed to dogs. Nothing goes to waste except manners. And let's talk about etiquette. There is a code, but it's more like a suggestion. Don't belch too loudly. Don't stab your neighbor unless you're in an official duel. Don't throw bones into the rushes unless they're small. But chewing with your mouth open, fair game. Using your knife to point at someone mid-insult, absolutely encouraged. Some knights prided themselves on how much they could eat. Chronicles tell of feasts where men devoured 12-course meals with 0 vegetables. One popular event included a whole roasted ox stuffed with a sheep, which was stuffed with a goose, which was stuffed with a chicken. Culinary matryoshka. There's a kind of status in what's on your plate. Venison. You've got noble friends. Roast suckling pig you're showing off. Goose eggs scrambled with bone marrow. Now that's a flex. But woe to the knight caught nibbling on lentils. You'd be accused of monk-like tendencies or worse frugality. You finish with a slice of pie, a pastry crust, hiding a mashup of rabbit, and minced eel thickened with lard and dyed bright yellow with saffron. It tastes like spiced oil and victory. Your belt is 1 notch tighter than it was an hour ago. Across the hall, a few squires are wrestling with a spit roast that's still dripping. It slips off the rod, lands on the rushes, and is immediately picked up, dusted off, and served. 5-second rule. Try 5-minute rule. If the dogs don't lick it, it's fine. You lean back your belly, full the fire crackling in the hearth. Somewhere, a lute player starts tuning up for the midday entertainment. But before that, there's one last indulgence: candied nuts or sugar-drenched dates. You pretend to demur, but your fingers are already sticky with honey before you can say just one. At this point, your body is somewhere between energized and comatose. The afternoon will bring more training, maybe a bit of falconry, or even a meeting about local land disputes. But for now, your meat-craving inner knight is deeply satisfied. You pat your stomach, belch softly, and thank God for pigs. Strangely, this diet wasn't just about taste, it was symbolic. Meat was masculine. It was expensive. It was proof you weren't some farmhand gnawing on barley loaves. Knights believed that eating meat made you braver, stronger, more virile. Whether or not that was medically true didn't matter. It felt true. And in a world of superstition and symbolism, that was all you needed. But let's be honest, you'll be hungry again in 2 hours. Good thing there's always a rabbit stew bubbling somewhere nearby. Coming up next, you think your car's important. Wait till you meet a medieval knight's horse, pampered, perfumed, and maybe even legally protected in a will. They say a knight without his horse is like a king without a crown. But what happens when the horse has a better name, wardrobe, and legal standing than half the nobility coming up war horses, so treasured they wore jewels, got baptized, and in at least one case had their own will? You're standing in the stables, the scent of hay, mingling with the rich musk of horse sweat and leather oil. Your destrier, your prized warhorse, is staring at you with a gaze that's 1 part affection, 1 part suspicion. You reach out, stroke his velvet soft muzzle, and whisper his name like a secret. Aurum, Latin for gold. Because, of course, your horse is named after treasure. Knights didn't just own horses, they bonded with them like siblings or soulmates. You didn't choose your steed casually. He was selected, trained, and raised with more attention than most noble children. In fact, raising a proper war horse took years and cost more than a small manor. From the moment he could stand, Aram was fed better than your squire trained daily and spoken to like a respected comrade. A good destrier wasn't just strong, he was intelligent, disciplined, and occasionally spoiled. You wrap the reins in your gauntleted hand and guide him out into the courtyard. His hooves strike the flagstones with a practiced rhythm. Behind him, your palfrey, a smaller riding horse for casual travel, waits with a servant, but the palfrey is like a sidekick. Orum. He's the main character. Historians still argue whether knights truly loved their horses or just saw them as assets. But the evidence is compelling. Knights named their steeds, with reverence wrote about them in journals, and even gave them blessings before battles. One French knight refused to fight when his horse fell ill, declaring that no other creature could carry his honor. Sounds like love to us. And it wasn't just names. Some knights decked their horses in armor more ornate than their own. Chainmail barding covered the flanks, a chamfron shielded the head, and sometimes a plume, yes, a plume fluttered from the bridle. If you're imagining a horse in a feathery helmet strutting into battle like a runway model, you're not far off. You lead Aram into the paddock for his grooming ritual. Two stable hands and a groom cluster around him, like attendants at a royal spa. They brush his coat with boar bristle combs, rub his legs with warming salve, and inspect each hoof like it's a gemstone. You watch nodding occasionally, as if approving of the massage strokes. But it's not all pampering. War horses were trained in a brutal choreography. They learned to rear on command, trample fallen foes, and twist sideways to shield their rider. Some could even bite enemies on cue. You once saw Aram snap at a squire who got too close with cold hands. He missed, but the message was clear. When it comes time to mount, it's not a casual swing of the leg. It's a process. Your squire holds the stirrup. You heave yourself upward in your heavy armor, and Aram shifts slightly to balance your weight. Once you're seated, you feel 10 feet tall. Not because you are, but because he is. And just in case you think it stops at pageantry, consider this: some knights wrote actual wills that included their horses. To my loyal steed, Clovis one reads, I leave my silver-studded saddle and enough oats to feed him for a winter. That's more than some relatives got. Feeding Aram is its own affair. Oats, barley hay, occasionally apples or honeyed mash. He gets first pick of feed before the castle dogs, cats, or servants. If he's particularly favored, a servant might even sing while brushing him. Singing to a horse. You don't question it. It's tradition. And don't get started on accessories. Embroidered caparisons in your heraldic colors. Decorative reins stitched with silver thread. Sometimes even jeweled amulets tied to the saddle for protection. One knight in Burgundy reportedly had a saddle charm shaped like a miniature saint. For the horse, not himself. Every knight knew your reputation in the field often began with your horse. If Aram charged well, you looked heroic. If he balked or stumbled, you looked like a fool. It was performance art with hooves. And God forbid your rival had a better steed. You'd hear about it in every tavern for months. The bond between you and Aram isn't just forged in gold and muscle, it's in shared danger. You remember the siege at Lochmere. Arrows darkened the sky, and you felt him shudder as one skimmed his flank. But he didn't bolt. He stood firm, breathing hard, like he knew what was at stake. You've never forgotten that. Tonight, before turning in, you'll visit him again. You'll brush his mane, check his hooves, and maybe whisper nonsense about the next tournament. He'll flick his ears, snort, and bump your shoulder with his nose. That's how you know you're okay. Not every knight had a destrier like Aram, of course. Some made do with half-trained chargers, broken down nags, or borrowed beasts. But you're the lucky one. You've got a war horse with eyes like judgment and a heart like steel. Next time you see a modern sports car commercial bragging about horsepower, just remember medieval knights measured worth in actual horses, and some of them were more pampered than royalty. And speaking of things that weren't exactly rational, let's talk about weapon superstitions next. Would you charge into battle with a sword you hadn't personally blessed with salt and moonlight? These knights sure wouldn't. There's something strange about the way a knight treats his sword, as if it's not just a weapon, but a partner, a protector, even a priest. What makes a man bless his blade before battle and curse it after a loss? Tonight we unsheathe the secret lives of medieval swords. You don't just own your sword, you bond with it. You were practically a teenager when it was forged custom-made by a blacksmith who muttered prayers over molten steel. The blade isn't just sharp, it's sacred. Engraved near the hilt are three tiny symbols, a cross, a crescent moon, and something that looks suspiciously like a fish. No one's quite sure what they all mean. Even the blacksmith refused to explain. You named the blade Worm Tamer. Not because you've slain any dragons, mind you, but because it sounds heroic and vaguely intimidating. Other knights go for classics like Bloodbite or God's Whisker. You still tease Sir Alric about that one. The name isn't for enemies, it's for you. It makes the sword feel like an extension of your soul. Before every campaign, you lay Worm Tamer on a clean cloth and sprinkle it with salt. Why salt? Because your grandmother once told you it wards off evil. And frankly, with the things you've seen, you're not taking chances. You trace your finger along the edge and whisper a few lines of Psalm 91. Your squire pretends not to watch. Many knights believed swords could be blessed by contact with holy relics, saints' bones, river water from the Jordan, or even a bishop's sneeze if they were desperate. Historians still argue whether this was sincere faith or just psychological prep. But either way, it worked. When you gripped Worm Tamer, after the blessing, your hands felt steadier. You've heard darker stories too. There's Sir Ewald, whose sword Nightmare was rumored to be cursed after it was dropped in a graveyard. Every battle afterward, it broke a little sooner, struck a little slower. Eventually, Ewald buried the blade in a monastery yard and swore off fighting. No one's seen him since. It's not just the blade. The scabbard, too, gets reverent treatment. Yours is lined with red velvet, stitched with runes you copied from a merchant's prayer book. You don't know what they mean, exactly something about protection, but they look important. You even tucked a tooth from your childhood pet hawk inside the seam. For luck. And don't forget rituals. Before battle, you draw your sword slowly, holding it flat in front of you, angling the steel toward the rising sun. The light catches the edge, flares white. You say a few words, half Latin, half nonsense, and kiss the hilt. The kiss is key. It seals the pact. Your fellow knights have their own habits. Sir Odo dips his sword in wine before every duel. Sir Jocelyn twirls his blade 3 times clockwise and once counterclockwise. Superstition, maybe. Or just a way to keep terror at bay. Because when you're riding into a melee and everyone's shouting and dying around you, sometimes it helps to think your sword believes in you. One knight, an odd fellow named Berengar, once claimed his sword spoke to him, whispered warnings, predicted weather. Berengar wasn't mocked exactly, just avoided. But no one wanted to duel him either. That sword Glimmerfang supposedly hummed when danger was near. Maybe it was just loose rivets. Maybe not. The church had opinions, of course. Officially, knights weren't supposed to treat swords like holy relics. Worshipping a blade skirted the edge of idolatry. But unofficially, monks blessed swords in secret all the time. A pious knight with a holy blade was better than a dead one with none. Even blacksmiths played along. Many etched protective charms into the tang, the hidden part of the blade inside the hilt, so only the wielder knew. Some used old Celtic symbols. Others copied Hebrew letters from scraps of ancient scrolls. Most knights never even saw them, but swore their swords felt different than standard fare. You remember one tournament years ago. A young knight arrived with a blade so brilliantly polished it reflected your face like a mirror. He refused to let anyone else touch it, claimed it had been baptized in the Nile by a priest during the Third Crusade. You rolled your eyes at the time. Then he won 5 jousts in a row. But sometimes swords go wrong. There was a tale of a blade forged during a thunderstorm that snapped during its first duel, nearly killing the knight. Stormborn, it was called. Last anyone heard, it was sealed inside a church wall just in case. Your own sword. It's been good to you. It's chipped at the edge, nicked from years of use, but reliable. You've cut through ropewood bone. You've held it in the rain during sieges once, while vomiting from bad mutton. It's never failed you. You polish it with care oil, the blade wrap the grip in new leather every spring. It's as much ritual as maintenance. And when you sleep, you keep it close propped beside the bed hilt within arm's reach. Not because you expect an ambush, though that's always a possibility, but because it feels wrong to be unarmed, naked almost. You've never told anyone this, but once when you thought you were dying wounded and feverish on a muddy battlefield, you apologized to Worm Tamer. Out loud. Called it old friend. Might have been the blood loss talking, or maybe it wasn't. Superstition sentiment. Who can say knights lived in a world where saints walked, relics wept, and stars foretold doom? If you wanted your sword to be lucky holy, or just plain loyal, you made it that way. But not every ritual involves blood and steel. Some involve goose feathers, falcons on velvet perches, and grooming routines fit for royalty. Coming up, how knights turned bird keeping into a high-stakes, high-fashion obsession. Before knights had Instagram accounts to show off their lifestyle, they had falcons and velvet hoods and hats with goose feathers worth more than a peasant's yearly wages. But why were birds treated like royalty? And why did plucking feathers become a status move? Let's crack open the medieval bird craze. You wake up with straw in your hair and chainmail stuck to your ribs par for the course when your mattress is basically a lumpy sack of hay. Your joints ache from yesterday's training, but something soft and familiar chirps above your head. Not a robin, not a sparrow. It's your falcon, and he's annoyed that breakfast is late. You call him Ember. Because of his red-tinted feathers? Maybe. Because he once drew blood from your squire's hand for daring to touch him? Definitely. Ember is not just a pet. He's a badge of honor. Knights were obsessed with falconry, and not in a let's feed the birds way. This was elite-level bird ownership, with rules, rituals, and a touch of madness. You slip into your gambeson and stumble toward the Mews, the falconry building nestled near the orchard. It smells of feathers fish and faint arrogance. Inside are perches lined with soft cloth, dainty water dishes, and hooks for the falconer's gloves. Ember's perch is at eye-level. Higher status birds got higher shelves naturally. A sleepy servant greets you, his hands already raw from feeding and cleaning. He bows carefully, avoiding Ember's glare. Knights didn't just keep falcons, they curated them. Ember was selected from a clutch raised by monks who swore each chick had divine temperament. You paid a small fortune for him, and he repaid you by pooping on your helm during your first hunt. Still, he's grown into a fine bird, sharp-eyed loyalish, and fashionably dramatic. Falcons were so important that they came with their own accessories. Ember has a custom hood made of saffron-dyed leather embossed with your coat of arms. He wears Jesse's thin straps for tethering and tiny brass bells to announce his arrival like a royal visitor. One knight you know paid a gold coin to have his falcon's claws gilded. It didn't help the bird hunt better, but it did impress the ladies. There's a strict social hierarchy in falconry. Emperors got eagles, kings had gerfalcons, knights like you, usually peregrines or sackers. Peasants were banned from owning falcons at all by law. Falcon ownership wasn't just a hobby, it was codified status. If someone saw ember on your glove, they knew who you were before you even spoke. You take Ember out for a morning flight. He perches on your leather glove, blinking disdainfully. You whisper a phrase you use only with him, something between a prayer and a joke, and toss him skyward. He vanishes into the misty blue like a streak of muscle and malice. As he soars, you watch other knights emerge with their own birds. One has a white-feathered beauty named Lyris. Another cradles a smaller merlin chirping anxiously. Falconry is part competition, part meditation. You're not just hunting rabbits, you're asserting elegance. Historically, falconry manuals were written in Latin and illustrated with gold leaf diagrams. Entire careers were built around training and maintaining birds of prey. Falconers ranked just below squires, and some received better meals. In a few households, the birds ate before the humans. That's not a joke. It's prestige. You and Ember spend the morning hunting along the forest edge. He catches a hare after 2 failed dives. You praise him with a chunk of salted meat and a scratch on the nape. He fluffs his feathers in approval. You feel a strange flicker of pride as if you snatch the hare midair. Back at the manor, Ember retires to his perch and gets brushed with a little powder to ward off mites. Your squire is in charge of cleaning his jesses and polishing his bell. A falcon's dignity must be maintained after all. But it wasn't just falcons that caught a knight's fancy. Feathers, in general, were fashion. Your hat sports a peacock plume stiffened with starch and curled at the tip. You wear it tilted slightly, because that's what Sir Emmerich did at the last tourney, and he won. Coincidence? You think not. Feathers were worn not just on helmets and hats, but on surcoats, cloaks, and sometimes infamously shoes. One bard described a knight whose boots were so feathered he left no print but pride in the mud. You've tried to forget that image, but it lingers. Some knights believed specific feathers brought luck. A raven feather meant cunning. A dove's meant peace, which you wore ironically into battle. And goose feathers. They were prized for writing quills, but also worn as symbols of humility. You know a knight who wore one after losing a duel. He said it was to balance his humors. Everyone else just called him Sir Goose. Feathers weren't just about looks. There were traditions around how you plucked them, gifted them, and displayed them. To give someone a falcon feather was a mark of deep respect or a romantic gesture, depending on the angle. You once gave a single feather from Ember's wing to a lady in red. She wore it in her hair for weeks. Then she gave it to another knight. You've never forgiven her or him. At court feasts, falcons were sometimes paraded around for admiration. birds on perches beside roast swans on platters. It was all part of the spectacle. A well-behaved falcon who didn't shriek during the music earned as much applause as the minstrel. You're still not sure Ember didn't time his screeches to ruin ballads on purpose. Even in death, falcons received honors. You've heard of knights who buried their birds with rings wrapped in silk placed near their tombs. One chronicler mentioned a chapel lined with tiny coffins. Real exaggerated historians still argue, but you'd believe it. You sit on a stone bench as the sun dips lower. Ember is fed and fluffed, the mews are quiet, and your feathered hat hangs by the door. You think about how strange it is that in a world of war and chaos, knights chose to anchor their sanity to a bird, not a sword, not a steed, a raptor with trust issues and an appetite for rodents. But maybe that's the point. Amid the clashing steel and endless duty falconry was beauty, controlled wildness, a fleeting moment where you and nature weren't enemies. Feathers birds, honor, and pageantry, it's all part of the knightly myth. But what happens when that same myth throws a banquet with jugglers' pig-shaped pastries and a hired fool balancing flaming torches coming up the nightly feast in all its roasted ridiculous glory? Quick question. If you saw a meat pie shaped like a castle, a live goose waddling around the table wearing a silver ribbon, and a court jester juggling flaming sausages, would you think you were at a banquet or dreaming? For knights, this was just Tuesday dinner. Let's step inside. The hall is already warm with firelight by the time you stride in cloak, swirling behind you. The scent hits you, first roast duck, glazed in honey cinnamon scented wine sizzling pork fat. Your stomach grumbles in anticipation, but you keep your face composed. Knightly dignity means pretending you're not excited even when your mouth is watering. Tonight's feast is hosted by Lord Athelard, who has a fondness for over-the-top theatrics. He once staged an indoor snowstorm using feather down. You're not sure the servants ever forgave him. This evening, the tapestries have been swapped out for fresh ones depicting scenes of mythic battle, and flower petals have been strewn across the rushes on the floor. Someone's clearly trying to impress. You take your place at the long oaken table beneath a chandelier of real antlers. Your goblet is already full-spiced wine that burns your throat just enough to remind you you're still alive. The servant beside you bows with military precision, his tray trembling slightly. You nod in approval, already noting what absurdity tonight's menu will hold. The first dish, a cockatrice, a creature fashioned by sewing the front half of a piglet to the rear of a capon. It's roasted whole and served with a garland of herbs and something disturbingly shiny in its mouth. You suppress a chuckle. Welcome to the feast. Feasting wasn't just about food, it was theater. Medieval banquets were like live performances, with dishes acting as the cast. Chefs competed to create the most imaginative culinary marvels. Swan deer boar, and even beaver tails, which were considered fish by a technicality, appeared on platters adorned with gold leaf. You sample a pie with crust embossed in the shape of a knight's helm. Inside, minced lamb, dates raisins, and hard-boiled eggs. It's bizarre, but oddly comforting. Next comes eel stew, which you politely push to the side. You're brave on the battlefield, but eel, that's a hard pass. A juggler performs between courses, tossing lit torches and slices of toasted bread in alternating arcs. You recognize him, Milo the Mad, known for balancing tankards on his head while whistling church hymns. He's wearing bells on every limb, and a codpiece embroidered with the face of St. George. You don't ask why. Feasts weren't only about spectacle, they were deeply symbolic. The dishes, often told a story. A pie might hide tiny cooked birds inside that flew out when cut. A cake might be sculpted into a castle under siege, complete with sugar paste ladders and almond flour soldiers. One knight once served a fish that breathed steam using hidden coals in its mouth. It made a child cry. You still feel a little bad about that. Next to you, Sir Baldwin is already tipsy waxing poetic about a turnip that changed his life. You nod along, but your focus is on the next dish stuffed peacock. Its body has been skinned roasted and then redressed in its own feathers, carefully pinned in place. The effect is haunting, like it might fly away mid-meal. You take a polite slice and try not to think about its eyes. Music flows from a trio of lutenists at the far end of the hall. Their melody is soft lilting and nearly drowned out by the sound of slurping and laughter. Someone throws a chicken bone at the jester. He catches it in his teeth and bows. You applaud. The courses continue. Pigeon with blackberries, spiced hare, and a puff pastry coffin, and a subtlety and edible sculpture meant purely for awe. Tonight's subtlety is a life-sized knight made of marzipan brandishing a licorice sword. When sliced, it oozes raspberry jam. You're equal parts delighted and disturbed. You glance down the table and spot Lady Gwenna raising an eyebrow at her boar's head platter, which is grinning up at her with glassy eyes and a lemon in its mouth. She nudges it with her knife just to make sure it's fully cooked. It wobbles. You look away. Feasts also served political purposes. Hosting a successful one showed power and generosity. Knights forged alliances over wine goblets and secretly negotiated marriages between bites of goose. But it wasn't all business. There were games, word duels, poetry contests, occasionally impromptu duels with blunted swords, hopefully. You once rhymed insults with a Saxon lord for 3 full verses. He still won't speak to you. The desserts arrive, fruit jellies shaped like fish, sugared violets, custards dusted with nutmeg. A servant presents you with a cake molded like your family, crest a lion biting its own tail. It tastes like almond and victory. By the time you recline slightly on your bench, your belt is dangerously tight, your head fuzzy, and your gloves sticky with honey. The jester is attempting to walk a tightrope made of sausages strung across 2 candelabras. You suspect the wine has gotten to him. And yet, in this gluttonous chaos, there's something human. These feasts weren't just indulgence, they were release. Knights lived with danger pressure and constant duty. A banquet was a rare chance to laugh, eat, and forget. If only for a night. Outside, the moon rises. The hall dims. Candles sputter as shadows stretch across the walls. You raise your goblet one last time, toasting no one in particular. Maybe to the absurdity of it all. Maybe to tomorrow's heartburn. Now you'd think all this spectacle was the peak of medieval knightly life. But what if I told you the jousts weren't really about combat at all? Up next, the surprising truth about staged jousts, fake hits, and choreographed knightly showdowns that would make even pro wrestlers blush. Not everything in a knight's life was as brutal as it looked. Ever seen a joust where the knight flies off his horse with perfect theatrical flair that wasn't always luck or injury? It turns out some of those epic clashes were more performance than peril. So what was real and what was rehearsed? The arena smells of churned up dirt and sweaty leather. Trumpets blare from the wooden gallery, and a crowd of nobles fans themselves beneath colorful pennants flapping in the breeze. You're astride your destrier armor, gleaming lance, angled just so helmet visor down. To the audience, You look like the embodiment of chivalric fury. Inside that helmet, you're grinning, because you know this is all for show. Jousting began as real combat training, sure, but over time, it morphed into something far more polished and far less deadly. By your era, many jousts were carefully controlled spectacles with agreed upon rules, prearranged matchups, and even the occasional, let's say, suggested winner. You nudge your horse forward as the herald calls your name with dramatic flair. You're facing Sir Lucian of Thornvale, an old friend and frequent opponent. The crowd doesn't know this, but the two of you already met behind the stables an hour ago and agreed 2 runs, 1 broken lance each, and you'll take the dramatic fall in the 3rd round. It's his niece's birthday. He wants to look heroic. Your squire hands you the lance hollowed at the tip, pre-scored for splintering. You grip it tightly anyway. Accidents can still happen. Last month, a new knight forgot to dull his point and ended up puncturing a viscount. He's now very banned. The trumpet sounds. You charge. The thundering hooves, the rattle of armor, the shout of the crowd, it all feels real because it is in a way. But your lance strikes exactly where it's supposed to center of Lucian's shield. It explodes in a satisfying burst of splinters. The crowd cheers. You both pull up circling for the next run. Back in the day before the rules jousting was dangerous chaos. Knights would use sharp lances, and victories were often fatal. One chronicler described a knight being unhorsed so forcefully his soul leapt before his body landed. A bit poetic, but not far off. To fix that, the sport evolved. By your time, jousts had marshals referees who enforced etiquette. Points were awarded based on where your lance struck, whether you stayed mounted, and occasionally, how stylish your plume looked while flying through the air. On round 2, Lucian hits your shoulder gently. The angle's wide, and your armor absorbs most of it. Still, you let your arm go slack and twist dramatically. From the gallery, Lady Isolde gasps. Perfect. Between rounds, squires bring water and adjustments. You both whisper under your breaths. Final round coming up. You're about to go airborne. The 3rd trumpet blast. You charge again. Just before impact, you lean, left shift your balance and let the lance strike your chest plate squarely. Then launch. You throw yourself backward, twisting in the air just enough to look accidental. You land in the dust with a satisfying thud and groan theatrically. The crowd erupts. Lucian dismounts immediately, rushing over with exaggerated concern. He offers his hand. You slap it away, knightly pride, and then take it. The herald declares him the winner. His niece throws flower petals from the stands. You sit in the dirt, catching your breath, grinning. That was fun. Jousts weren't just sport. They were community events. They brought lords and ladies together, gave local armorers a chance to show off, and let bards compose songs about daring deeds that were 40% true and 60% poetry. Of course, not every joust was staged. Some were serious, especially during grudge matches. A feud over a land dispute. That's a full contact tilt. But the majority of tourney jousts were as much about flair as ferocity. You once heard of a knight who choreographed his entire entrance. Trumpeters, flag wavers, a dance troupe, and his horse wore a cape made of rose petals. He lost the 1st round, but people still talk about his cape. And let's not forget the pas d'armes, elaborate knightly roadblocks, where a group of knights would block a bridge or castle gate, demanding a joust from anyone wishing to pass. Sometimes they set up tents had theme colors, and handed out handkerchiefs from noble ladies as symbolic favors. One famously themed his challenge around the sorrows of autumn. No one really knew what that meant, but his banners were stunning. Back at the tent, you peel off your armor as servants fuss over the dust in your hair and the fake dent in your shield. Lucian swings by, grinning, and tosses you a sugared plum in thanks. You remember what jousting really is, a carefully constructed illusion. One where knights can be heroes, villains, or lovers, depending on the script. And honestly, that's half the fun. You wash off the sweat and smear of dirt, wondering if your theatrics will earn you a new nickname. Sir Tumbler has a certain ring to it. But as your squire packs away your lance, a thought hits you. What if all those performances weren't limited to tournaments? What if knights bragged on paper just as much as they did in the arena? Coming next, how medieval knights invented the humble brag, writing long, boastful letters so dramatic even modern influencers would blush. You've probably heard of knights sending love letters or writing battlefield reports. But what if those reports were just thinly veiled brag fests? Think LinkedIn posts in Latin sprinkled with humble piety and outrageous ego. Curious how a sword swing turned into a three-paragraph metaphor. Let's open the medieval mailbag. Your writing table is cluttered with parchment wax seals, half-melted candles, and a quill that keeps splitting at the tip. You're in your best tunic, though you're not going anywhere. This is Correspondence Day, an essential part of the nightly image. Your fingers are stained with ink, your heart swollen with self-importance. You dip the quill in ink and begin to the noble and ever-wise Lord Osric of Belleron. You pause, not poetic enough. You scratch it out and try again. To the most esteemed and virtuous defender of the northern ridges, whose wisdom commands even the stars. Much better. Writing letters was a knight's opportunity to shape the legend of his life. The battlefield was for bruises, the parchment for polish. You might have fallen off your horse mid-charge, but in your letter you descended with righteous force landing amidst the enemy like thunder made flesh. A single duel becomes a divine encounter. As the sun blinded my foe, I struck not with anger, but with mercy. You leave out the part where your opponent's horse tripped on a molehill, and you barely managed to keep your balance. Details. And always, always, you include a line about humility. I am but God's servant, unworthy of the glory my blade has tasted. Followed by 4 paragraphs describing the exact angle at which your blade entered a Saracen's armor. Letters were how you maintained alliances, impressed nobles, and lured potential patrons. You sent them with wax seals bearing your crest, often wrapped in perfumed cloth if addressed to a lady. Scented messages were the medieval version of a filtered photo, same content, better impression. Some knights hired scribes to write for them, especially if their Latin was shaky. The scribes added flourishes, dramatic phrasing, and the occasional biblical quote, even if it didn't quite make sense. As it is written in the book of Job, he who wields a broadsword must also sharpen his mind. Job said no such thing, but it sounds impressive. You remember a letter you received from Sir Renard. He described his most recent campaign in 10 pages, including a full list of every meal he consumed. On the 5th evening, I partook of a roast capon with clove-scented wine, which bolstered me for the duel to come. You kept the letter out of sheer admiration. Historians still argue whether these knightly letters were read earnestly or with a smirk. Some lords likely took them at face value. Others probably read them aloud during dinner, pausing to laugh at phrases like, "My enemies fell before me like wheat at harvest." But knights didn't just write to brag. They wrote to mourn, to accuse, to challenge. A well-written letter could be the start of a feud. You once received a note that said, "Your lance speaks louder than your lineage." 2 weeks later, you were in a ring, with that night both of you bruised and breathless. Sometimes, letters were dispatched before tournaments, essentially taunts wrapped in etiquette. May your arm remain strong, though I fear it will not be enough to parry destiny. That sort of thing. You've written a few of those. One ended with a wax-stamped drawing of a duck wearing your opponent's helmet. It was art, and there were love letters. Oh, the love letters. Flowery, tragic, overwritten. Though miles divide us, my thoughts rest upon your brow like dew on a violet. You once tried that line. The lady replied with a drawing of an actual violet squashed and a note that said, "Please send gold instead." You've learned to tone it down since. Letters often traveled with messengers, runners, riders, even falconers for light notes. You trained your squire to deliver messages with a dramatic pause before handing them over, just to build anticipation. At court, people passed letters discreetly during feasts. Some were slipped into gloves, others tied to wine bottles. You once received one hidden in a pie crust, a little greasy but heartfelt. One famous knight, Sir Adamar the Boastful, compiled his letters into a book. He called it Reflections from the Blade. It's mostly battle recaps, food reviews, and surprisingly decent poetry. You own a copy. It's hilariously pretentious. Still behind the bombast, there was truth. These letters were lifelines. In an age without selfies or status updates, they were how knights sculpted their legacy. They knew memory fades, but parchment survives. You seal your own letter with a sigh. In it, you've mentioned your latest hunt, your recent sparring win, and a vague philosophical musing about honor and mud. You hand it off to your squire, who ties it to his saddle and rides off into the evening mist. Then you lean back, stretch, and glance toward your travel chest. Time to start packing your next campaign beckons. But not just any campaign. This one ends in Jerusalem. And trust me, what knights bring back from the Crusades is almost stranger than what they do there. Coming next, camel hair cloaks, relics of questionable holiness, and why some returning knights look like tourists who raided a holy souvenir shop. Ever met someone who went on vacation and brought back way too much? Now imagine that person is a knight returning from the Crusades with a cloak made of camel hair, a vial of holy water, and possibly an embalmed lizard he swears is sacred. What exactly counts as a souvenir? Your boots crunch against the dockside gravel as you dismount. The ship behind you creaks, sails sagging after weeks at sea. You're sunburned, sand-coated, and frankly exhausted but triumphant. You've returned from the Holy Land, and you haven't come back empty-handed. Tied to your saddle is a bundle wrapped in dyed linen. Inside relics. Or at least, relics. A small stone allegedly from Mount Calvary. A fragment of wood someone claimed was part of the true cross. It smells suspiciously like pine. A glass flask filled with water from the Jordan River, though after months of travel, it's mostly just murky sludge with a bug floating in it. Still, it's sacred. Probably. Pilgrimage and warfare had blended into one epic journey, and every knight worth his salt came back with proof. You remember the markets in Acre, teeming with merchants, hawking sandalwood incense and bone fragments wrapped in silk. Some items were real. Many were definitely not. One man tried to sell you a feather from the Archangel Gabriel's wing. You bought it anyway. Your cloak, once simple wool, is now trimmed with camel hair. Its scratchy smells like the desert and earns you admiring nods from passing nobles. It also makes you sneeze constantly, but that's the price of exotic fashion. Another knight returned, wearing a striped silk tunic embroidered with Arabic script he couldn't read. It might say, God is great. It might say, this side up. Who knows? Historians still argue whether these souvenirs were expressions of faith or just fashionable trophies. Probably both. The Crusades weren't just spiritual quests, they were adventures. And what's an adventure without keepsakes? In your satchel, you've packed more oddities. A tiny silver flask shaped like a temple, a handful of dried dates, and a coin stamped with a crescent moon. You plan to turn the coin into a brooch. Not because it's valuable, just because it looks impressive pinned to your tunic. Your most prized item, a small bottle of holy oil from a monastery outside Jerusalem. The monk who sold it said it was used by St. Helena herself. You're fairly certain he says that to everyone, but still you guard it like treasure. Some knights brought back live animals. One noble arrived with a monkey in a turban. Another imported 2 peacocks that refused to eat and spent most of their time screaming. You considered a desert lizard, but it bit your finger and ran off. Probably for the best. More ambitious knights returned with architectural inspiration. One duke built a chapel modeled after a shrine he saw in Antioch. Another remodeled his garden to mimic the steps of Golgotha. It looked more like a pile of mud, but he was very proud. Of course, not every souvenir made it home intact. You lost 3 trinkets during a storm at sea and 1 to a curious goat in Sicily. You still don't know how it got into your pack. There's also the strange matter of miracle relics. You remember Sir Anselm boasting about a jawbone fragment from a martyred saint. It turned out to be a donkey's molar. Didn't stop him from wearing it around his neck. Claimed it protected him from nightmares. You guess it worked. He hasn't mentioned bad dreams since. Some knights got tattoos, real medieval Christian tattoos inked by Coptic monks in Jerusalem. Tiny crosses sometimes with Greek or Latin inscriptions. Painful, permanent, and rare. You almost got one, but the needle looked suspiciously like a fish bone, and you'd had enough suffering for one pilgrimage. When you finally ride through your village gates, children crowd around to see the foreign knight. You let them touch the camel hair fringe. One asks if the bottle of holy water will make plants grow faster. You say yes. You're not sure, but it seems hopeful. You place your relics on a shelf in your chamber, light a candle, and just look at them. A hodgepodge of symbols, stones, spices, and cloth. Some sacred, some ridiculous. All part of your story. And yet none of them compare to the memory of that desert sunset when you stood on a ridge and watched golden light spill across olive groves and ancient ruins. That moment won't fit in a bag, but it stays with you all the same. You know these keepsakes will become talking points. At feasts by hearths during duels of one-upmanship. They prove you were there. They prove you returned. And sometimes that's all a knight really wants. You hang your cloak, unstrap your satchel, pop open the jar of desert honey you forgot you packed. It tastes sandy, but sweet. Souvenirs collected stories, prepared you're ready for the next chapter. Speaking of stories, ever wonder why some knights stitched boars or dragons onto everything they owned, from their banners to their breeches? Up next, the strange world of knightly mascots, identity branding, and underwear, embroidery, you didn't ask for, but now can't unlearn. Here's a question you didn't know you needed to ask. Why did medieval knights have personal mascots like boars, lions, or even snails stitched onto everything they owned? And how far did they take it? Spoiler, yes, it includes their underwear. Let's dive into the surprisingly obsessive world of knightly branding. You're lacing up your boots one morning when you glance down at your linen underclothes and spot it, your family's boar tusks, flared embroidered in rust-colored thread right above the hemline. It grins at you like a hairy guardian of modesty. You don't question it. That little boar has been stitched onto your garments since you were old enough to hold a spoon. In the medieval world, heraldry wasn't just a battlefield identifier, it was an obsession. Every knight had a symbol, an animal, a plant, a mythical creature, or even a geometric shape, something that told the world who you were, and ideally, what kind of knight you hoped to be. Your family chose the boar generations ago, allegedly because your great-grandfather once wrestled one into a stew pot. The truth is hazy. The embroidery, however, is eternal. You ride out into the courtyard, your tabard fluttering in the wind. The boar is there too, this time emblazoned across your chest tusks, outlined in gold thread. Your shield boar, saddlecloth boar, tent flaps boar. You're practically running a personal PR campaign centuries before anyone knew what public relations meant. Heraldic mascots weren't just decorative. They served real functional purposes. On the battlefield, a knight's visor made it impossible to see his face, but his banner, his crest, those were clear. If someone saw a red lion on a silver field charging through the melee, they knew Sir Alaric was near. And if the red lion ran away, they knew Sir Alaric had probably eaten something bad. Of course, the symbolism was everything. Lions meant courage. Bears meant strength. Eagles, nobility. But it wasn't always that straightforward. One knight, Sir Giraud of Clairvaux, chose a snail as his emblem. He claimed it symbolized patience and divine timing. Everyone else thought it was hilarious until he won 5 tournaments in a row. The Snail Knight, they called him. He leaned into it, even had snail-shaped spurs made. Historians still debate why knights grew so attached to these mascots. Some say it was psychological, an anchor of identity in a world of chaos. Others argue it was about legacy. Your symbol told future generations what kind of knight you were. It was your emoji before emojis existed. You remember visiting a heraldic artist once? He unfurled a parchment scroll filled with tiny boars in every pose imaginable, charging, standing, even sitting thoughtfully beneath a tree. He called it personality options. You went with the charging pose. Classic. The embroidery wasn't limited to battle gear either. Feast tunics bore stitched mascots. Pillowcases bore mascots. One knight even had his symbol woven into the edges of his chamber pot towel. You'd question it, but then again, you've got boars on your bootstraps. There were rules, of course. Heraldry followed strict design codes, only certain color combinations were legal. Gold couldn't touch silver. Animals had to face left. Wings could be raised or folded, but never mixed. And heaven help the knight who copied someone else's beast. Heraldic theft was a serious insult, sometimes punishable by duel. Some families got creative. The House of Montmorency bore 3 red whips crossed on a field of white. The green mantles used a crow with one wing dipped in blue. You once saw a banner that featured a naked man riding a fish, symbolic supposedly of humility and abundance, or something. The mascot wasn't just external branding, it shaped your reputation. People remembered the Wolf of Wexham or the Raven Knight long after they forgot actual names. You've been called the Iron Boar in 3 different songs. Only one got the verse order right. There was even a kind of mascot diplomacy. At tourneys, knights exchanged embroidered patches of their symbols as gestures of respect. You have a drawer full of stitched lion's hawks and once a tiny frog. That one was from Sir Cedric. He said it represented unappreciated courage. You suspect it was a joke. Your squire, bless him, once tried to surprise you by stitching your crest into your tent flaps using glow-in-the-dark thread. It wasn't historically accurate or very visible, but the effort was charming. You left it up anyway. Mascots also appeared on seals. Your letters are stamped with a wax boar. Even your dagger pommel is carved into its likeness. It watches you eat. You try not to think about that too much. And yes, it's true. Some knights commission special underclothes with their heraldic beasts. Why? Who knows? Maybe it was for luck. Maybe just for consistency. You once heard of a knight whose mascot was a fox wearing spectacles. He had a fox stitched onto the seat of his trousers. Irony, brilliance. Either way, he won his duel. You pass another knight in the corridor. His surcoat bears a rooster with flaming wings. He nods solemnly. You nod back. No words exchanged, just mascots acknowledging mascots. That's the knightly code. Later at the feast, someone asks about your boar. You launch into the tale again. You add some extra flair this time, involving a lightning storm and a haunted forest. Nobody questions it. By now your boar might as well be a mythical creature. As the night winds down, you sit in your tent, surrounded by stitched tusks and gold thread. It's silly. It's over the top. It's also kind of comforting. In a world of shifting alliances and unpredictable battles, your boar stays constant. He's on your shield, your boots, your nightshirt. He's you. But if knights stitch their personalities into every visible surface, it shouldn't be too surprising that some of them took it one step further by literally singing about themselves before battle. Coming next, meet the singing swordsmen. Those lyrical knights who composed songs, recited poems, and crooned their way into legend, and sometimes into the enemy's confusion. Imagine you're marching into battle, and instead of a war cry, your opponent bursts into a ballad. No, not as a joke on purpose. Why did knights recite poetry, sing odes, and sometimes even rhyme while charging with swords drawn? Let's meet the troubadour warriors who brought a lute to a lance fight. The night before the skirmish, you're sitting by the fire, oiling your blade, and humming a tune. Across the camp, Sir Alain is plucking his lute with all the seriousness of man writing his will. He pauses mid-chord, then scribbles something on parchment. You hear him whisper, "No, no, moon doesn't rhyme with doom." Wait, yes it does. He smiles satisfied. You roll your eyes, but you secretly admire his dedication. Alain's not just a knight, he's a trouvère, one of those rare breeds who combine swordsmanship with songcraft. And he's not alone. Plenty of knights dabble in verse, but some make it a full-blown identity. By dawn, Alain's new composition is done. Before mounting his horse, he clears his throat and belts out the first verse to the rest of you. It's dramatic, romantic, and includes the phrase, "bloody lilies." You're not sure what that means, but it sounds poetic. The squires applaud. One archer bursts into tears. The enemy won't see it coming. Knights singing before battle wasn't as rare or ridiculous as it sounds. In fact, it was expected in some regions. In Aquitaine, Provence, and parts of northern Italy, the line between knight and troubadour blurred regularly. You weren't just expected to fight, you had to entertain with your voice. Your own attempts at verse have been mixed. You once rhymed valor with saddle sore. Your squire still brings it up, but that hasn't stopped you from trying. There's something strangely soothing about turning battlefield anxiety into lyric couplets. Historically, many knights were trained in courtly arts. They learned the lute, the viol, and even early pipe instruments. Singing was considered a noble skill, like falconry or calligraphy. And unlike falconry, it didn't require feeding mice to anyone. The songs weren't always original. Some knights favored old ballads, stories of saints, ancient battles, or doomed lovers. You once heard Sir Tormund sing an entire epic about a knight who fell in love with a dragon. Everyone assumed it was symbolic. At least, you hope it was. But some knights did write their own battle verses. Sir Piers of Dorne was infamous for composing haiku-like stanzas before duels. Steel sings through sunrise. Let not my heart beat quicker than thy trembling blade. You never understood why that worked. But it did. He won every time. There were even knightly bands, small troops of warriors, who toured courts performing song poems about their victories. Like medieval boy bands, but with more armor and fewer synchronized dance moves. Of course, not everyone appreciated the musical flair. A few gruffer commanders banned singing outright, calling it noise before nonsense. One famously said, "If you have the breath to rhyme, you're not swinging hard enough." He was later immortalized in a sarcastic song called The Unmelodious Earl. It was a hit. Songs served tactical purposes too. Marching chants helped keep pace. Rhythmic calls signaled formations. Some verses included secret phrases known only to a commander's men. You once used one to disguise a retreat. Through storm and flame, we yield to honor's call. Sounded noble, meant run now. And then there were serenades. Yes, battlefield serenades. On the eve of combat, knights sometimes stood outside the tents of noble women, strumming sad chords and whispering about fate and lilies and moons. It rarely worked. But when it did, it really did. You remember one tournament where a knight named Emmerich sang a verse before each match. Every time he did, the crowd roared louder. His opponents felt like extras in his story. Even the herald said, "I now announce Sir Emmerich the Versed. You never forgot that." Still, it wasn't all theatrics. Singing calmed nerves. Reciting poems steadied hands. There's something about structured language, rhythm, and melody that keeps the chaos at bay. You've felt it. A steady beat in your head as you ride. A phrase looping anchoring you. And there's magic in it. Not literal magic, but the kind that stays with people. After a battle, when the field's cleared and helmets are set aside, someone hums a tune. Another joins. And suddenly, the horrors blur into harmony. It doesn't make sense, but it helps. Tonight back at camp, Sir Alan plays his new composition again. It's about courage and stars, and possibly a metaphor about bread. He sings off-key, but everyone claps anyway. You lie back, sword beside you, and let the notes drift upward. You hum your own tune, quiet rough, barely remembered. You're a knight, and tonight, you're a lullaby. But poetry can only soothe so much. Tomorrow, one wrong word might force you into a duel, one with rules, judges, and a whole lot of legal drama. Coming next, when insults turn into deadly calendar appointments, and why medieval knights kept duel referees on standby. It starts with a glance, maybe a muttered word, Maybe someone mispronounced your family name on purpose. Suddenly, you're exchanging formal gloves, scheduling witnesses, and dusting off your dueling doublet. Why did medieval knights turn petty insults into ceremonial showdowns with referees' rules and legally sanctioned swordplay? Let's break it down. You're at a feast picking lamb out of your teeth with a toothpick made from carved bone when Sir Ralph says, "Of course, if your lands were as well managed as your mustache, perhaps the wheat wouldn't rot in the fields." Everyone freezes. Now he could be complimenting your mustache. But no, that tone, that smug sip of wine, that knowing look over the goblet, that's a challenge. You place your goblet down carefully, slowly. "Would you care to clarify, Sir Ralph?" He smiles. "Oh no, I think I was quite clear." A hush falls over the table. You stand. He stands. A servant faints. The next morning, your squire is assembling your dueling kit. 2 gloves, a backup dagger, a red sash, and your formal tunic with fewer bloodstains. The duel will take place in 3 days on neutral ground, with a priest, 2 marshals, and a local noble acting as judge. The insult wasn't even that serious. But in knightly culture, it's not the content, it's the tone. Duels of honor were common and surprisingly regulated. Medieval knights weren't reckless brutes stabbing each other in alleyways usually. They followed procedure. First, an insult, real or perceived. Then a formal challenge, often by tossing a glove or slapping it dramatically onto a table. You once saw a knight throw a glove into a pudding bowl. Slightly less impressive, but the point stood. Next came negotiations, time, place, weapons. Sometimes it was swords, sometimes daggers, occasionally lances. In rare cases, crossbows at 20 paces not recommended. You and Sir Ralph have agreed on longswords. Standard fare. First blood wins, unless someone faints, or the priest intervenes, or someone's horse goes into labor, surprisingly common. Your second Sir Ernald is coaching you through likely phrases. If he mentions your great-uncle's trial pivot to your lineage's holy relic collection, stay composed. Keep your feet wide. It feels more like prepping for a play than a fight. But that's the point. These duels were as much performance as punishment. On duel day, the crowd gathers early. Nobles, peasants, one wandering bard. A makeshift ring is roped off. The judges arrive with scrolls and a weighing scale. Don't ask why. You and Ralph stand on opposite sides, arms folded, trying not to shiver. A herald reads the charges. Loudly. Sir Ralph of Fenmarch has been accused of impugning the honor wheat yields and mustache of Sir Edwin of Greywick. You hear a snort from the crowd. Probably your cousin. Swords are presented, inspected for fairness. Yours is slightly lighter, but within regulation weight. Ralph's is gleaming, clearly polished just for today. Probably hasn't seen battle since the chicken coop incident. You salute. He nods. The judge raises a hand. Begin. The duel starts with caution. You circle. Exchange light blows. You land a shallow strike on his shoulder, first blood. But wait. The judge didn't see it. A marshal steps in, wipes the blade, shakes his head. Doesn't count. You try again. This time, Ralph lunges. His blade scrapes your hip. Not deep. Just enough. The priest holds up a cloth. Red. Match. You lost. But you both bow. Ralph offers his hand. You hesitate, then shake it. Duels of honor weren't about killing, they were about resetting the social clock. The insult has been answered. Your honor is intact. His victory symbolic. You head back to your manor, limping a little. Squire buzzing with questions. Did you mean to slip on the moss, my lord? Was that scream yours or his? You mutter something about strategy and order a bath. Historically, duels could be more intense. Some ended in death. Others were called off mid-fight when tempers cooled. Occasionally, kings banned them, only to host private duels in their gardens. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Some knights became infamous duelists. Sir Bertil of Norham fought 37 duels. He survived all of them barely, and once dueled a man with a broken arm and still insisted it was even odds. There were duels over insults, land boundaries, romantic entanglements, and once over a particularly ugly tapestry. The fight lasted 12 seconds. The tapestry was later burned. You've heard of trial by combat, too, where a legal dispute is settled by who wins the fight. Divine judgment, they called it. Let God choose the victor. No pressure. As the day ends, you reflect on how bizarre yet necessary the duel felt, like a social reset button. And honestly, you kind of enjoyed the audience, the drama, the spectacle. You sit by the fire adjusting your bandage and sipping mead. Another story for your collection. And as you lean back, you wonder, did knights fight just for honor? Or did they secretly compete to be the best dressed in battle? Coming next, silk, surcoats, gold-plated chainmail. And why looking fabulous in a fight was half the point of being a knight. What happens when knights go into battle dressed like runway models? Ever wonder why chainmail came in gold surcoats, in scarlet silk and plumes as long as a goose's neck? We're not just talking armor. We're talking battlefield fashion wars. Get ready for the clash of couture and combat. You're tightening your sword belt, adjusting the line of your mantle, and trying to get your coif to sit just right beneath your helmet. The squire fussing over your surcoat is sweating more than you are. You snap gently, not that crease. Because yes, you're about to ride into a potentially deadly skirmish, but that's no excuse to look sloppy. You step out of your pavilion. Sunlight catches your armor polished to a mirror shine. Your surcoat billows in rich crimson embroidered with your mascot, your good friend, the boar outlined in silver thread. Your spurs are gilded. Your gloves are suede. You smell faintly of lavender oil and ambition. And across the field, Sir Lucien. Oh, Lucien. His armor is blued steel treated to give it a deep midnight sheen. His tabard is teal-edged with golden knotwork. His helmet plume, white peacock feathers. Excessive, yes. Fabulous, absolutely. The moment you see him, you know today's battle will be fought on two fronts, steel and style. This wasn't unusual. Knights weren't just warriors, they were walking propaganda. Your appearance was your billboard, your business card, your family history. The brighter, cleaner, and more coordinated you looked, the more people assumed you were noble, capable, and terrifying. And yes, part of that was peacocking literally. Silk surcoats weren't just for feasts. Knights wore them into battle often dyed in the most vibrant hues available. Deep red from madder root, saffron yellow, indigo so intense it shimmered violet in sunlight. Some even wore dyed chainmail, coated in enamel paints, or gilded with thin gold leaf. Not for protection, for presence, and the plumes. Oh, the plumes. Feathers were affixed to helms, for flair for luck, and occasionally for passive aggression. A red plume meant fire and fury. A green one, hope and rebirth. A particularly dramatic knight once wore a plume so long it dragged on the ground. He claimed it represented humility. Everyone else claimed he tripped on it. Twice. You once heard of a knight who wore a cloak made of damask lined with swan feathers on a rainy day. It soaked through in seconds and stuck to his armor like soggy parchment. Still, no one forgot his entrance. Historians still debate how practical all this was. heavy silks, gold trim, velvet saddle blankets. One school says it was performative waste, showing you could afford to ruin luxury. Another argues it helped morale because when you look like a myth, you fight like one. You remember a tourney where Sir Ambrose showed up in armor, etched with miniature hunting scenes, complete with foxes and hounds. His horse wore silver bells, and his shield was mother of pearl inlay. He was eliminated in the first round, but by fashion metrics he won. There was strategy too. Colors carried meaning. A knight might wear morning black to unsettle enemies, or white to appear untouchable. Some wore opposing family colors to mock rivals. One duel began simply because one knight's outfit clashed with his opponent's tabard. Tensions escalated. So did accessories. Even armor design got theatrical. Some helmets had sculpted faces. Others sported wings horns or animal visors. You once saw a helm shaped like a lion's head with movable jaws. Roaring was optional. It didn't breathe well, but the intimidation factor was top tier. And don't forget the horses. Your destrier Aurum wears matching barding saffron silk over mail with tassels dyed in your house colors. His hooves are polished, his mane braided. When you two ride out together, people notice. He knows it too. He poses for portraits. In some armies, elite knights were separated into color-themed divisions. The Red Host, the Order of the Blue Mantle, the Gold-Cloaked Brotherhood. Each squad fought and dressed together, coordinated and colorful, like very stabby chess pieces. Of course, dressing well was risky. You stood out. Bandits targeted the flashiest knight. Archers aimed for the one with gold thread. But that was the point. You weren't just a warrior. You were a statement. There were even fashion rivalries. Sir Tristan wore a silver-mirrored breastplate that blinded opponents in sunlight. You responded with a surcoat woven with tiny steel discs. The duel was inconclusive, but fashion won. Not every knight could afford the glam. Poorer fighters patched tunics with fur scraps or dyed their armor with crushed berries. It didn't last long, but it gave them a moment, a flash of brilliance before the mud set in. You remember once asking a monk why knights cared so much about appearances. He shrugged. "We are all stories, Sir Knight. Might as well dress like one. Tonight, after the dust settles, you'll remove your armor and find your tabard stained and singed but still intact. You'll brush off the ash, smooth the silk, and smile. Because even if you lost, you looked good doing it." But not all knightly legacy comes from gold threads and gleaming shields. Some knights spend their last coins planning how to be remembered. Coming next, extravagant tombs, self-written epitaphs, and why medieval knights were obsessed with becoming stone legends long after death. You can only fight so many duels, wear so much gold, or sing so many battle ballads. Eventually, every knight thinks about one thing: how to be remembered. But what does it say when someone spends more on their tomb than their castle? Let's step into the grand, solemn, and slightly absurd world of knightly legacy. You're walking through the cathedral boots, echoing on the stone sunlight, filtering through stained glass. Ahead lies a row of tombs, effigies in marble alabaster, and even gilded bronze. Each knight is posed dramatically, sword on chest feet, on lion's eyes gazing heavenward in eternal, heavily stylized sleep. Some even have their helmets off to show their carefully carved curls. These were men who planned their forever selfies. You pause before one Sir Cedric of Lorne. You never knew him, but clearly he wanted to be remembered. His effigy shows him mid-prayer, a book open in one hand, symbol of wisdom, and his other hand resting on a tiny cathedral model. symbol of church donations. Below that, an inscription he definitely wrote himself. He rode with honor, spoke with virtue, and fell only to time. Poetic, and just vague enough to imply he was undefeated in battle. Back in your own hall, you've started thinking about your own legacy. You've already got a list of requests for your tomb eyes closed, but smiling bore on the shield. Do not make me look bald. Your squire suggests adding a carved falcon at your shoulder. You nod. Good touch. This isn't vanity. Well, not just vanity. Knights lived in a world obsessed with death and memory. Your body might rot, but if your tomb sang the right story, your legend lived on. Effigies weren't cheap. Marble had to be quarried and shipped. Artisans worked for months. One knight bankrupted his manor to pay for an angel-covered sarcophagus, then died 2 years later in a pig cart accident. Tragic, yes. But at least he looked glorious in stone. Some knights were buried in full armor, entombed upright, or laid with their swords deliberately broken symbolic gestures about peace readiness or humility. You're not sure what yours will be. But you've seen Sir Baldwin's design. He has two effigies, one in armor and one beneath it, showing him as a skeleton. He calls it the honest duality. You call it unsettling. There's more. Some tombs had sound. Not magical, just clever. Hollow pipes carved beneath, so wind would whistle through. Whispering graves, they were called. One knight had his own poems carved in spiraling lines around his effigy's boots. Another requested that visitors kiss his statue's hand for luck. It's shiny from centuries of lips. You once saw a tomb guarded by carved dogs meant to symbolize loyalty. Another had weeping cherubs holding scrolls. And one had a carving of his wife, looking away. Historians still debate whether that was symbolic grief or a final snub. Legacy wasn't just for tombs. Knights wrote testaments, personal dramatic wills, filled with final messages. Yours will probably include something about your horse, your squire maybe, and definitely your falcon. Ember deserves a line or two. Then there are the funeral feasts. Full-on events with musicians, actors, and enough food to make guests forget why they were sad. You once attended one where the deceased knight had his victories read aloud like a bard's scroll. Including that time he wrestled a turkey. Unconfirmed. Of course, some knights went beyond. Sir Galien of Bourges had a church commissioned in his honor with a bell tower shaped like his helm. Sir Merrick had a stained glass window of himself, riding into heaven, escorted by angels' doves and his own dog. Even the Pope was baffled, and not every knight was buried in a church. Some chose forests, mountain ridges, or places of personal significance. You've heard of a knight who requested burial at sea, with his shield used as a raft and his sword planted like a mast. It probably didn't go well, but the idea was romantic. You think back to your early days, training in the mud, barely able to lift a sword. You never imagined you'd one day be sketching tomb ideas and trying out epitaphs during lunch. But here you are. Maybe your tomb will say he sang poorly, fought well, and never spilled his wine. Or maybe just Sir Edwin Knight of the Boar, braver than most, handsomer than all. Your squire rolls his eyes. Perhaps remembered fondly, occasionally bathed. You write it down, just in case. At the end of the day, every knight wants to leave a mark. Not just on the battlefield, but in stone and song, in whispered tales by candlelight. You hope your mark is bold, a little ridiculous, and unmistakably you. But don't drift off just yet. You've ridden with boars, sung to falcons, and written your own glory. Now, it's time to wind down with the quiet fade of torchlight, the soft rustle of banners, and a gentle close to our long nightly journey. Here's something to ponder. As the torches dim, what does a knight dream of when the armor's off the swords sheathed and the halls go quiet? As our story closes, we explore the gentle rhythms of the medieval night, the bedtime habits, sleepy reflections, and soft rituals of those who lived by steel. The fire crackles low in the hearth. The room smells of beeswax soot and the faintest trace of old lavender oil soaked into your tunic. You sit on the edge of your narrow bed, unlacing your boots with hands that still ache from the day's sparring. Outside, the wind brushes against the stone walls, a hush settling over the manor like a woolen blanket. Bedtime for a knight isn't immediate. You've got routines. You check your sword still there, within arm's reach. Wormtamere rests against the wall beside your cot blade wrapped loosely in a linen cloth. Even now, after years of peace, you keep it close. Not paranoia, just habit. You wash in a wooden basin with water warmed earlier by the fire. It's tepid now, but it does the job. You scrub the day from your face, neck, and hands. Your squire snores in the next room, a sound not unlike a bagpipe being slowly strangled. You let it slide. Then you change. Not into a nightgown, exactly more like a long shirt of soft wool, once white, now the color of old parchment. Over it goes your usual night robe embroidered yes again with your house crest. Even in sleep the boar watches. You settle into bed, straw-stuffed mattress, rough linen sheets, and a pillow that's seen better decades. It crinkles when you move, and there's definitely a goose feather poking out. Still, it's yours. You arrange your limbs to avoid the worst pressure points from old bruises and scars. Being a knight isn't gentle on the joints. And finally you think, not about glory, not about war, but about details. Tomorrow's to-do list. Whether your falcon will molt soon. If you should re-oil your chainmail. Whether Lady Elise was actually impressed by your latest poetic outburst, probably not, but maybe. The thoughts drift gently, like autumn leaves, across a quiet stream. In this calm space, you reflect. All the rituals, all the odd habits, the feasts, the duels, the falcons, and fashion and legacy games carved in stone. It's all part of a larger rhythm, one that tells a story not just of violence and honor, but of peculiar humanity. You remember the laughter during that feast when Sir Emmerich's trout pie exploded. You remember the warmth of your horse's breath on your fingers in winter. You remember how your mentor once called you the most stubborn pinecone of a page before teaching you how to block a sword swing with a cloak. There's meaning in all of it. Not grand meaning, not destiny, just memory. The candle on your bedside table gutters low. You watch the flame dance, then shrink, then vanish. Shadows take the room. Your eyes grow heavy. Outside, a night breeze rustles the nearby trees. A barn owl hoots once. Distantly somewhere in the hills, a hunting horn sounds and fades. Inside, your breathing slows. One last glance at your sword. One last mental check of the door bolt. All is still. All is ready. And so the night sleeps. The world quiets now. The torches burn to embers, little halos of orange, casting long shadows across stone walls. You lie still, beneath the linen, every breath slower than the last, every muscle releasing just a bit more. No battles remain tonight, no patrols, no duels, only rest. You can feel the weight of the day fall away, like armor slipping from your shoulders. The ache in your sword arm fades. The slight tightness in your back unwinds. Even the little cut on your finger from that stubborn buckle is forgotten now. Nothing hurts. Nothing presses. All the tales you've wandered through tonight, the absurd, the gritty, the gloriously unheroic truths, have peeled back the myth and shown you the man beneath the metal. Maybe knighthood wasn't about chivalry or glory after all. Maybe it was about surviving the mud, the weight, and the endless pretending. So as you lie there now, not in chainmail, but under soft covers, remember this. The past isn't always what the stories said it was, and sometimes that truth is more fascinating than the fantasy. If tonight's journey changed how you see knights, even just a little, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with a friend who still thinks medieval glory was all swords and honor. Hit subscribe and get ready, because the next story might just twist your view of history even more. And hey, tell me in the comments what surprised you most about real medieval knights. Now take a breath. Let the night settle. Let your thoughts wander. You're not off to war. You're off to dream. Sleep well, brave one. Tomorrow the myths can wait. But before the myths return, ask yourself this. What if the greatest knight in history never fought a single battle? That's a story for another night.